It's late April 1945. Adolf Hitler is in the throes of a nervous breakdown. It's the end for him, and he knows it. He calls for one of his secretaries, Gertrude Traudl-Junge, and tells her to take down his last will and testament. Tearfully, she listens and writes down his insane words. His takes on all things: all of this bloodshed is not my fault. The 4 other witnesses in that room, as well as Hitler, will be dead within 24 hours. We'll talk in depth later about the deranged will and testament, which encapsulates just how insane he was. Hitler had known for a long time before that, maybe since 1943, that the war was lost, but he still clung on to the hope that there might be peace negotiations. Then, at the beginning of 1945, his enemies encroached further and further toward Berlin. The Soviet Red Army was intent on crushing Germany. The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, whom Hitler had the nerve to call a barbarian, knew victory was close. In January alone, 450,000 Germans died, and in the 3 months that followed, 280,000 died. This was more German casualties than from 1942 to 1943, which shows you just how stubborn the Nazis were in not accepting defeat. In February, Hitler's command in Hungary watched as his men fell into a state of utter gloom. In his report, he wrote, "Amid all these stresses and strains, no improvement in morale or performance is visible. The numerical superiority of the enemy, combined with the knowledge that the battle is now being fought on German soil, has proved very demoralizing for the men." German people ran from their homes as the Soviets moved in. One woman wrote, "The world is a very lonely place without family, friends, or even the familiarity of a home." In April, a Russian soldier wrote to his beloved back home saying, "At first the fascists fought back fiercely, but they could not endure this hell. Everything is bound to finish soon." On April 16th, Soviet forces had invaded Berlin, finally. Inhabitants heard the gunfire not far off in the distance. Some people ran to the shops to get what remained of food. One of them, Ruth Andreas Friedrich, poetically wrote, "Before us lies the endless city, black in the black of night, cowering as if to creep back into the earth, and we are afraid." The Nazis still relentlessly kept on killing. They emptied jails and shot those who resided there. German firing squads killed scores of people deemed a non-supporter of the regime. POWs and concentration camp prisoners were lined up and massacred. The order given by Hitler was to keep going. But Berlin was doomed, with now even the Hitler Youth fighting toe-to-toe with the enemy. One woman explained what she saw, saying there were young baby faces peeping out beneath oversized steel helmets, and that it was frightening to hear their high-pitched voices. She said this went against human nature, and nothing could be better accredited to the madness of war. You might wonder why so many people fought on in Germany. The historian Max Hastings wrote in his book Inferno that the Germans were well aware of the fact that they would be given no mercy from the Red Army. It was a matter of fighting back or being murdered. The Russians had been on the wrong end of so much savagery themselves, they weren't in the mood for sparing the enemy, which, as they saw it, was all of Germany. Still, the atrocities committed on German civilians can't be ignored. One woman starkly summed it up, saying, "It can't be me this is happening to, so I'm expelling it all from me." It was during these last few days of barbarity that Hitler sat in his bunker under the Reich Chancellery. After hearing of the death of U.S. President Roosevelt on April 12th, he'd actually held out some hope that the new president, Harry Truman, would sign a peace treaty. That didn't happen, of course. Hitler suffered a breakdown on April 22nd when he heard that his orders for a counterattack hadn't been followed through. He screamed and cursed the people he said had betrayed him. It was on this day that Hitler finally admitted to himself that all was lost. This was 2 days after his birthday, which you can understand didn't involve much celebration. He did, however, make this his last public appearance to congratulate some Hitler Youth who were ready to die for him. He was in such a state, he had to keep one of his shaking hands clasped behind his back. He then went back to the bunker, knowing his life would soon be over. It was there that he would be married to his mistress, Eva Braun. We know that in the last day or two, one of the many things that occupied her mind was hiding her precious jewelry. In her last letter to her friend Herta Ostermeyer, she wrote, "On no account must Heisey's bills be found. What should I say to you? I cannot understand how it should have come to all this, but it is impossible anymore to believe in God." Many of Hitler's inner circle made their plans to escape Berlin. Second in command, Hermann Göring, was one of them. Göring had told Hitler on his birthday that he had business to take care of and he needed to go over to southern Germany. That much was true. He was trying to ship his stolen art treasures out of Berlin. So like Braun, he was worried about losing things of monetary value. Not long after, it would get back to Hitler that Göring had spoken to the enemy. This infuriated Hitler, and it would make Göring a prominent feature in his will. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary in the Nazi Party Chancellery, was one of the inner circle to stay behind in the bunker. He'd later flee after seeing the end of his leader, but he'd be dead soon enough too. Then there was the propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, who was also there those last few days. He would be made Chancellor of Germany, but in the end he, his wife, and 6 kids would all be lost in that bunker. As Berliners were suffering unimaginable torments that late April, Goebbels made one final announcement. He said, "I call on you to fight for your city. Fight with everything you've got, for the sake of your wives and your children, your mothers and your parents. Your arms are defending everything we have ever held dear, and all the generations that will come after us. Be proud and courageous, be inventive and cunning." How both he and Hitler could still ask people to fight in the face of certain loss was a testament to their egoism and insanity. Then on April 27th, Hitler got word that another of his closest had betrayed him. He heard through a BBC report that Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler had tried to negotiate a surrender with the enemy. Hitler raged like he'd never raged before. To him, that meant one thing: treason. Hitler ordered the arrest of Himmler, after which Himmler went into hiding. He too didn't survive many more days. It was true, though, what Hitler had heard. Himmler had attempted to negotiate peace. Hitler's world was falling apart, but he still decided that there was still time to get married. At the stroke of midnight on April 28th, Hitler and Eva Braun tied the knot. Both Goebbels and Bormann were there at the ceremony, but as you can imagine, with the Red Army just around the corner, it wasn't the merriest of affairs. If there was any kind of event, it only involved having a wedding breakfast with booze, lots of booze. At some point, Braun signed off on the marriage certificate, and she wrote Eva B, only to cross out the B and then write Hitler. She was now proudly Eva Hitler, but she wouldn't get much time to enjoy the marriage. Hitler's barber, August Vollenhaupt, would usually trim his mustache at around 11 a.m. This was also usually the time that his valet Heinz Lenga would visit him each morning. Lenga would act as a kind of referee, saying the German for "on your marks" while holding a stopwatch. After that, Hitler would get ready as quickly as possible, as if playing a child's game. Then Lenga would pass Hitler his spectacles and the morning newspaper. One of those days close to his death, Hitler wasn't exactly in a great mood. He looked at Lenga seriously and said, "You must never allow my corpse to fall into the hands of the Russians. They would make a spectacle in Moscow out of my body and put it in waxworks." Lenga also gave Hitler some cocaine drops for his painful right eye. He also handed him some pills for a flatulence problem. Hitler had many health problems close to the end, for which he took something like 28 different medications. In fact, he was starting to look like a man on the verge of dying from natural causes. Hitler Youth, who later escaped the bunker, described what the Führer looked like during those final days. He said, "He was like a ghost. He didn't seem to see me or anyone. He just stared ahead, lost in thought." At that moment, the bunker was shaken by a strong tremor as a bomb hit. Dirt and mortar trickled down on us, but he made no attempt to brush it off. He looked so much more unhealthy than 10 days earlier at his birthday reception when I had first met him. It looked like he was suffering from jaundice. His face was shallow. It was around this time that Hitler had heard the news about the death of the Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini. He'd been summarily executed, which could only mean one thing to Hitler. He too, he knew, would very likely suffer a similar fate. Even worse, he heard that Mussolini, along with his dead mistress, had been dumped like dead cattle in Milan's Palazzo Loreto. There, the crowd spat on their bodies before hanging them up by meat hooks. Hitler then heard that the Dachau concentration camp had fallen into the hands of the Americans. He very likely heard what happened there. The US soldiers had been so appalled to what they saw, they gave no quarter to the German soldiers they captured. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Now Sparks later said the smell of death was overpowering. What those soldiers witnessed was human cruelty on another level. It may never be known what happened on that day. Some reports say US soldiers massacred 520 Germans, but other reports say the number was as low as 50. After an investigation, it was ruled that while international law had been breached, in the light of the conditions which greeted the eyes of the first combat troops, it is not believed that justice or equity demand that the difficult and perhaps impossible task of fixing individual responsibility now be undertaken. Hitler, on hearing the news in his bunker, likely thought about this violent retribution, while the image of the dead Mussolini and his mistress were still in his mind. Also in the distance, he knew the Soviet army was laying waste to his city. It was around this time that Hitler called that secretary Traudl Junge. She would die an old woman in 2002 and always said she wasn't aware of the depth of Nazi atrocities. She also admitted she loved her dear leader, something in later life that gave her cause to feel guilty. She once said, "I admit I was fascinated by Adolf Hitler. He was a pleasant boss and a fatherly friend. I deliberately ignored all the warning voices inside me and enjoyed the time by his side, almost until the bitter end. It wasn't what he said, but the way he said things and how he did things." She said Hitler made it clear to everyone in the bunker that the one thing that he could not allow was his body to fall into the hands of the encroaching Soviets. As for the writing of his will, Junge had woken up from her usual nap around 11 p.m. After that, she went to see Hitler, as she would usually drink tea with him at that time. Hitler's vegetarian cook, Fraulein Constance Manzeili, also attended the tea-drinking sessions. But that night, when she knocked at the door, something was different. Hitler said to her, "Have you had a nice little rest, child?" She replied, "Yes, I've slept a little." Hitler said, "Come along, I want to dictate something." One thing he told her was that he wanted his body to be cremated. He said he wanted his art collection to go to a gallery in the town of Linz, which he called his hometown. As for the little things of perhaps more sentimental value, or what he called items for the maintenance of a modest, simple life, they should go to relatives and his faithful workers. Anything else of value, he said, should go to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Here's a snippet from his testament, word for word. "Since I did not think I should take responsibility for entering into marriage during the years of combat, I've decided now, before termination of my life on this earth, to marry the woman who, after many years of true friendship, entered voluntarily into this already almost besieged city to share my fate. She goes to death with me as my wife, according to her own desire." He then went for a bit talking about how he'd given his life to the service of his country, saying he had not intended to go to war in 1939. He said of the reason for the war, it was desired and provoked entirely by those international statesmen who were either of Jewish origin or worked in the Jewish interest. He had the gall to add, "The responsibility of the outbreak of this war cannot rest on me." He even said history won't blame him for the bloodbath of the war, but will blame international Jewry and its assistants. The British, he said, were offered a solution to what he called the Polish-German problem, but the responsible circles in English politics wanted war. He then called out Himmler and Göring as traitors and wrote down a list of names who should fulfill certain positions. His final words, "Above all, I obligate the leadership of the nation and its followers to the most minute observation of the radical laws and to pitiless resistance against the universal prisoner of all people, international Judaism." Given at Berlin, 29th of April 1945, 4 a.m., Adolf Hitler. There were 4 witness names, Goebbels, Bormann, Bergdorf, and Krebs. All 4 would soon be dead. Sometime later, while Hitler's SS bodyguards were destroying all the documents around the bunker, doctors followed orders and poisoned his much-loved Atlassian dog, Blondie. Braun's spaniel was also forced into the afterlife. It was around this time someone heard Braun say, "I would rather die here, I do not want to escape." A lot of silent handshaking took place as Hitler looked for the last time into the eyes of people that had supported him. It seems that Braun's last words were to the secretary Junge, who accepted the gift of a coat. With it, she heard the words, "Take my fur coat as a memory. I always like well-dressed women." It was Goebbels that announced the death of Hitler, stating in a message that the time of death was 3:30 p.m., April 30th. Hitler and Braun were subsequently cremated in the garden of the Reich Chancellery as Soviet artillery could be heard close by. Goebbels and Bormann soaked the bodies in petrol and lit them, after which they gave the Nazis salute. The fighting didn't just stop after that. As an observer of this extra bloodshed, a British lieutenant named David Fraser remarked, "There is still too much vile cruelty in the world for us to be able to say with true satisfaction good is victorious. Let's hope nothing like it ever happens again." It's just days before Operation Overlord, better known in the history books as D-Day. Over 1 million men from 5 different nations will simultaneously launch several landings across the French coast, a military operation the likes of which has never been attempted before. Waiting across the English Channel are several 100,000 German defenders, sitting in heavily fortified bunkers, overseeing beaches littered with mines, barbed wire, and concrete tank traps. Hitler and his generals know that an invasion is coming. Up until now, the war has been largely Britain fighting for her life, with the Soviets in the Far East being easily defeated. The Americans have conducted several operations in northern Africa with very mixed success, but now the bulk of their forces are finally in Britain, eager to join the fight. Any day now, the true battle of Europe will begin, and the Germans hold all the advantages. Suddenly, German radio operators begin picking up radio chatter from American and British units. The operators are quick to identify several of the Allied units broadcasting, including several American and British infantry divisions, armored divisions, and even General Patton's headquarters itself. The alarm is immediately raised. Something big is going down, and soon. The Luftwaffe is ordered to put recon planes up into the air, and as they make the short trip across the channel, they take photos of column after column of tanks, trucks, and artillery, all lined up and ready to board landing craft. German Army headquarters is immediately alerted to the pending invasion, and General Rommel himself orders reinforcements to rush to Calais, directly across from the preparing invaders. He even commits the bulk of his armor reserve to the area. The Allies must not be allowed to gain so much as a toehold on Europe. They must be met directly on the beach and thrown back into the ocean. Another reconnaissance flight over the massing forces is ordered, and the pilot confirms the locations of the Allied forces, reporting thousands of armored vehicles and trucks waiting to be loaded. As the plane turns around from overflying the massed troops, a stiff wind suddenly picks up, and one of the tanks starts to float away. Hurrying, a soldier ducks out from under a tent and rushes to the tank, tying it down with a rope and securing it from the stiff breeze. Luckily, the German plane seems to have taken no notice of the peculiar incident. As Germany prepares to defeat the largest invasion in military history, there's just one problem. The American and British tanks and other vehicles are all made of rubber, barely more than inflatable balloons. The giant invasion army is fake, a ploy engineered by the British and carried out with the help of the US's 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. And the real invasion force is massing right now for a landing dozens of miles away in Normandy. Known as the Ghost Army, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was a military outfit like no other. Its members were men specifically recruited from the world of advertisement, visual arts of all sorts, carpenters, and talented actors. Their job was simple: fool the Germans by pretending to be something they were not, and the 1,100-strong unit was tasked with staging elaborate displays that would make the Germans believe they were facing a much larger threat than they really were, making use of inflatable tanks, rubber airplanes, and plywood artillery. Officially known as tactical deception, this elite troop of soldiers would be critical in confusing and confounding the German military throughout the course of the war. The Ghost Army ultimately staged 20 battlefield deceptions between 1944 and 1945. Their performances, or illusions, as the members insisted on calling their cunning tricks, would often take place within just a few hundred yards of enemy lines, putting them in just as much risk as any regular soldier. Yet, unlike regular soldiers, if the enemy didn't fall for the trick, they might be left with nothing more than rubber tanks to fight with. In order to fool the Germans, the Ghost Army created something called atmosphere, a term familiar to any theater or film artist. In essence, atmosphere simply means creating a believable tone or impression for the audience, and in this case, the audience was German military units and undercover spies. To do this, the members of the Ghost Army would wear uniforms from different military units and make sure they were seen marching by enemy scouts. The scouts would then return back to their headquarters and report that members of a specific unit were operating in the local area, while the real unit, along with all its firepower, was in actuality somewhere else entirely. This would lead the Germans to deploy their forces to defend from imaginary threats, fearing for instance an attack by an American armored division, when in reality that same division was preparing to attack somewhere else far away. To help sell the illusion though, the soldiers of the Ghost Army would drive trucks or tanks, sometimes as few as just 2, in constant looping convoys, creating the illusion of a much larger unit being transported to the front lines. The clever actors would also learn to impersonate radio operators from different units, mimicking not just their voice, but also the way they sent Morse code messages, down to every minute idiosyncrasy of the specific operator. All these tiny details would add up to a very convincing deception, leaving the Germans utterly confused as to the real state of affairs across the combat front. Ghost Army soldiers would also put their acting talents to use in person, often spending time at French cafes near the war front, where they knew they would be overheard by German spies. The soldiers would wear uniforms of different infantry or armored divisions, again sowing confusion as to the true location of the real units. And they would talk loudly and openly about upcoming tactical operations. Commensurate actors, the Ghosters would learn their roles well, playing everything from overexcited new recruits eager to see their first combat and accidentally spilling operational secrets, to even high-ranking generals bragging about upcoming operations to pretty waitresses, while knowing that a German spy would certainly be within earshot. Sometimes, though, it was just enough to be seen and not heard, and soldiers would often parade around pretending to be very high-ranking Allied officers, making German spies believe that major operations must be about to take place in areas where no such operations were being planned. If you've ever acted in a school play and thought it was nerve-wracking, imagine trying to play the part of a very high-ranking officer in World War II, knowing that your performance could save or doom thousands of lives. Ghost Army soldiers used every range of their artistic talent in the fight to liberate Europe, and this included audio engineers. Today, you might hole yourself up in a room with some music software and cook up some sick beats to get a few likes on Facebook. But for the soldiers of the Ghost Army, creating convincing mixtapes made up of the sounds of different vehicles and tanks could mean the difference between life and death. These soldiers worked in conjunction with Bell Labs back in Fort Knox and recorded dozens of different types of military vehicles, everything from tanks to trucks and even jeeps. The recordings were written directly into wire recorders, bleeding-edge technology at the time, and then transported to the battlefields of Europe. A modern DJ may have to mix different tracks together to entertain an audience, but in World War II, the Ghost Army's own DJs would be tasked with mixing all the different recordings of armored vehicles to create a realistic soundscape of an advancing army. If the recordings or the mixing just wasn't right, the entire ploy could collapse, and Ghost Army soldiers had to do this with primitive equipment mounted on the back of a half-track loaded with giant speakers. No doubt a difficult task. The tactic was nevertheless effective in fooling the Germans several times, and the recordings could be heard as far away as 15 miles, giving the impression of a very large force moving through the thick woods of Europe's forests. Another brainchild of the Ghost Army was spoof radio, and it used actors impersonating radio operators from other units. They would do everything from report fake troop movements to even calling in fake radio reports from imaginary combat zones, complete with a soundscape of battlefield noises to make the performance believable. Thus, German units might be fooled into thinking that American forces were retreating by picking up the broadcast of a panicked soldier calling for a retreat, when in actuality the forces were digging in to lure the Germans into a trap, or weren't even in the area at all. The fake battlefield broadcasts also confused the Germans, making them believe that their own units, which were not engaged in battle, had been engaged. Confused German commanders would be forced to contact individual units to try and clear the fog of war, leaving opportunities for Allied troops to act before the Germans could properly react. Spoof radio was so successful that it even fooled Axis Sally, otherwise known as Mildred Gillars, an American woman turned Nazi propagandist. She would go on to report that an entire Allied division was preparing for battle at a place with no troops at all. Ghost Army soldiers would often protect other soldiers in a much more active way though. During D-Day and several other major operations, Ghost Army artists created realistic-looking decoys that became tempting bombing and artillery targets for the Germans. This would include artillery emplacements, fake landing barges, and groups of parked vehicles. The elaborate displays would sometimes even be lit up with lights, as if someone was being accidentally careless, making them that much more tempting for the Germans to strike at. Attacks on these fake military positions saved countless Allied lives. Sometimes, though, ghost soldiers would simply mirror pre-existing positions, such as artillery sites, diverting fire from the real emplacement and once more saving lives. As the fight for Europe moved to the east, so too did the Ghost Army. In September, after the D-Day landings, the Ghost Army impersonated the entirety of the 6th Armored Division, effectively plugging a gap in General Patton's assault on the French city of Metz. German forces looked for a vulnerability to exploit, and instead were faced with a continuous line of American forces, leaving them no room to outmaneuver the American advance. Had the Germans not fallen for the ruse, they would certainly have broken through the American lines and flanked the real attack by General Patton, potentially dooming the entire assault. Imagine being the German general who would learn later after the war that rubber tanks were what defeated him in one of the pivotal battles for Europe. Yet, as impressive as the Ghost Army's deceptions were up to this point, one of their greatest illusions would take place toward the end of the war. In March 1945, Allied forces were preparing to cross the Rhine River, and at last into the heart of Germany itself. Victory was within sight, if they could just get across the very heavily fortified Rhine. Any attempt to cross would be bloody, with casualties projected in the tens of thousands, and yet the attack was necessary to finally bring an end to World War II. The Ghost Army would play their part in the attack, and were tasked with the incredible job of simulating 2 entire infantry divisions, or about 20,000 men and all their equipment, with just 1,100 soldiers. The Ghost Army would set upon the impossible task with gusto, calling on every ounce of artistic creativity to fool the Germans into believing the main assault across the Rhine would come far away from the actual attack. To do this, they ran a mounting concert of radio broadcasts, simulating troop movements and orders between different brigade and division commanders, a performance that convinced the Germans real units were moving into the area. Across the river, the Ghost Army blasted its carefully mixed soundtrack of troops, vehicles, and heavy equipment, making sentries posted along the Rhine believe that just across the river from them, the illusionary divisions were preparing for an attack. The deceit worked perfectly, and incredibly, when the real American units made their crossing of the Rhine, they encountered little, if any, resistance, laying bare Germany's heart. The Ghost Army is credited with saving tens of thousands of lives and helping ensure victory in World War II. Its soldiers were certainly cut from a different cloth, being professional and amateur actors, painters, and artists of all sorts, and bringing their incredible talents to their nation's aid in one of the darkest times in modern history. Their contribution to victory, however, is likely best immortalized in the results of the D-Day invasions, when even as the main assault force was making landfall in Normandy, the Germans refused to send reinforcements, believing the real attack to be a diversion for the fake attack by rubber tanks waiting for them across the channel. Adolf Hitler stands on the podium to great applause. His chaotic mind is racing as the crowd screams out "Heil Hitler!" A crowd made up of not just Germans but various nationalities that have fallen under his evil spell. The superpower of Germany is untouchable. There's no such thing as the Soviet Union anymore. The great of Great Britain is lying in the mud. Millions are being executed while millions more are enslaved in Hitler's labor camps. There's just one more thing to accomplish, and that's annihilating the USA, to subdue what Hitler regards as a low-down, dirty race of mongrels. He has won, and it's hell on earth for many. We'll get around to this standoff with the USA, but first we need to know how Hitler pulled it off, this unbelievable victory in Europe. Here we mix reality with fiction. As you know, at the start of the Second World War in 1939, Hitler's army, the Wehrmacht, devastated Poland. With its legion of panzer tanks and an incredibly efficient mobile infantry, the Poles were no match for the Germans. The attack was like lightning, which is what the word blitzkrieg was derived from. In September, German bombs were dropped on the town of Luck, not just destroying buildings, but even killing kids on their way to school. This sent a message of what was to come. The Polish pilot B.J. Solak noted, "The stench of burning and a brown veil of smoke filled the air all around our town. No one was spared." The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, rained hellfire down on Poland. Trains were seen derailed from the tracks. Kids screamed at the sight of the dead. It was a terror no one could have expected, and so on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Amazingly, France was beaten in just 6 weeks, and in time, something worrying occurred. Surprisingly, most of the French accepted the new Vichy government, one sympathetic to Nazi ideology. Not many know that a large number of people in France endorsed Hitler's hatred toward the Jews. Bear this in mind as we go through this story today. But by that time, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg had already been beaten by the Germans. It was as if the German soldiers were on steroids, which isn't far from the truth in the view of their heavy use of powerful methamphetamine, Pervitin. And with Norway defeated, Hitler now had access to heavy water. Although not known at the time, this is a key ingredient in the creation of the nuclear bomb. This was bad news. When France fell and the British were left scurrying for their lives on the escape from Dunkirk, it looked as though the Germans were totally invincible. These conquests so far meant tens of thousands of Germans killed and many more injured. France itself had lost 50,000 men in the invasion, Britain lost 11,000, but now Germany had a massive 1.5 million prisoners of war. It would have been much worse had the Brits not had their miracle at Dunkirk. Britain was at this point waiting for the Battle of Britain. It was a frightening thing to imagine. Not many people thought this small island nation could hold its own, but the fighting spirit still burned within Britain. As a wounded British soldier named Paul Ritchie said when he was flown back to England from France, he couldn't imagine his country going the same way France had. In his own words, he said, "With my mind still filled with the blast and flame that had shattered France, I was seized with utter disgust at the smug contentedness enjoyed behind the sea barrier. Still, he worried about what was around the corner." On June 18, 1940, Winston Churchill spoke at the House of Commons. In his impeccable oratory style, he said, "I expect the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life." He was probably right. Churchill went on, "Hitler knows he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age." He said that upon the defeat of Germany, men will say that this was their finest hour. And take note, he said Hitler would go after the USA. It was just a matter of time. According to this cigar-munching elitist who admittedly was drunk and drugged up half the time, still, he correctly envisioned the hell that Hitler would unleash. That's why Churchill was so against settling with Hitler. He was sure that at some point the furious Führer would have Britain in shackles and take over his empire. Hitler would not stop, not until Nazi ideology pervaded the globe. The Battle of Britain commenced. In the skies, British Hawker Hurricanes and Spitfires fought it out with German Messerschmitt Bf 109s. The so-called dogfights were crazy, and many young pilots who went up did not come back down. Alive, anyway. Here is how one Spitfire pilot described a day at work. "We were both flying in a tight circle, just a little more and I'll have him. Pressing the trigger, I waited expectantly for the 109 to explode. I've hit his wing. He was one of the lucky ones. Life expectancy for an RAF pilot during the war was a grim thing indeed. 60% of operational airmen died, were injured, or became prisoners of war. Around 51% of all RAF aircrew died. Bombs from German Junkers rained down on strategic locations in England, with sirens blaring on a regular basis during what the Brits called the Blitz. It went on for 8 months. But the British down below were typically amenable to hardships. One woman wrote in her diary, "I wonder what the pilots feel. After all, somebody loves them even if they're Nazis." At some point, Hitler made the mistake of withdrawing aircraft for Russia's planned invasion in May 1941. That really was a mistake. It turned out the Germans lacked a cogent strategic plan. The planes also often missed their targets, and British scientists were good at reading German signals and jamming their radars. The British public showed fortitude too. A woman named Barbara Dixon wrote that she'd never even heard of Poland, but she'd do anything to repel the beast of Hitler, who she said was trying to blow us up or murder us in our beds. Historians say attacking Britain was one of the great blunders Germany made in the war, with the next one being the invasion of the Soviet Union. Had Hitler focused all his strength on Britain and not at one point said, "Okay, we'll come back for you later," the Brits might have settled with Germany. Many people in Britain wanted that. They didn't think Hitler was as crazy as he turned out to be. Hitler had many times expressed his liking for British culture, and he said, unlike those mongrels in America, Britain had a good Aryan culture. Prior to German propagandists criticizing the British for their empire's atrocities and their plutocrats living like kings while the working class lived in the slums, Hitler had some pretty good relations with certain British politicians. Britain's army was nothing compared to the German army, and no one really expected them to hold their own in the skies. Even the U.S. ambassador in London, Joseph Kennedy, said Britain had no chance. Despite 23,000 civilians dying and around 33,000 injured, with the German retreat, confidence was bolstered. It's thought 1,000 RAF planes were shot down, with about 544 fighter command pilots losing their lives. Then, with bombers and Coastal Guard losses, that added up to 1,542 planes lost and another 1,542 lives lost. The German Luftwaffe lost around 1,800 planes, and more than 2,500 pilots were killed. Across the pond, an American journalist wrote Adolf Hitler met his first defeat in 8 years in what might go down in history as a battle as important as Waterloo or Gettysburg. Winston Churchill uttered those now famous words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." This bolstered confidence in the US too, and elsewhere in the world. Germany wasn't invincible. It sent a strong message, and for Britain at the time, having the most powerful navy in the world, it knew no Germans would be walking down its streets anytime soon. But as we said, Hitler planned to come back for Britain just as soon as he'd taken care of other matters, namely the Soviet Union. The reason we spent some time on this matter is that had Britain been soundly beaten and backed down, the whole outcome of the war would have been different. With Britain out of the war, Germany could have focused less time on one very formidable foe in Europe, in Asia, and in Africa. It would have also sent a strong message to the Soviet Union and to the United States. Remember, the US didn't want to get involved in a bloody European war. US citizens didn't want their young men being shot to pieces far from its now incredibly industrious shores. But in our alternative universe, let's say Germany did succeed in having air superiority over Britain. Germany might have launched Operation Sea Lion, the planned land invasion of Britain. This was not Hitler's first choice. He had been hoping for the British to accept his offer to back down out of the war. This is what Hitler had said he needed to happen for that invasion to be successful. First, he said the RAF had to be beaten down in its morale, and in fact that it can no longer display any appreciable aggressive force in opposition to the German crossing. Then he hoped the English Channel would be swept of mines, and if the British Navy was distracted with fighting in the North Sea and the Mediterranean, it would make crossing the Channel into England more achievable. Apparently, even Hitler's inner circle wasn't keen on this idea, and if you read the writings of contemporary historians, most will tell you he would have failed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt suspected Hitler was just trying to bluff Britain into pulling out of the war. He said, "By God, even Napoleon failed to invade Britain." The place was a veritable fortress. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was no match for the British Navy. It ruled the waves, and it had done so for years. But in our scenario, Britain lost in the air. The morale of the military and the public was very low. The British Navy, as Hitler wanted, was spread out. The German Navy fought remarkably, better than expected, and before you could say Schadenfreude, the powerful British elites were foreseeing losing their empire while watching panzer tanks make a mess of that beautiful British grass. The country soon surrendered, just as France had. Now Britain was finished. Hitler could certainly win the war. With France and Britain subdued, and to our modern shame, many people in both countries were now buying into Hitler's Aryan rubbish, the Germans could now go full throttle at the Soviet Union. Okay, back to real life. Hitler had made a non-aggression pact with another tyrant, Joseph Stalin, but then he invaded Russia anyway. Never trust the word of a tyrant. The German army, full of confidence, was sure it would walk through Russia. They also said they were doing the right thing. As this 18-year-old German soldier named Henry Mettelmann said, "I accepted as natural that it was German duty for the good of humanity to impose our way of life on lower races and nations, who probably, because of their limited intelligence, would not quite understand what we were on about." Hitler hated Jews, but he was no fan of Slavs either. His notion that most Germans were pure Aryans was utter ridiculous, given centuries of the intermixing of people in Northern Europe. It was ridiculous, full stop. But even so, he was prepared to annihilate Slavish people. As for communists, once he'd won the war in Russia, they would either have to forfeit their ideology or die. The many millions of Jews in the Soviet Union would be hunted down and killed. As General Erich Heppner said, "The war with Russia is a vital part of the German people's existence. It is the old fight of German against the Slav, the defense of the European culture against the Muscovite Asiatic flood, and the repulse of Jewish Bolshevism." So mark our words, the people of the Soviet Union would have been spared no quarter, or at least those that fit into Hitler described as the lower races. And while Joseph Stalin, by the time he died, had the blood of tens of millions of peoples on his paranoid hands, his zero tolerance to people not fighting was one reason why Germany couldn't defeat him. The Soviets killed around 300,000 of their own soldiers for refusing to fight, fighting badly, or going AWOL. People starved because of Stalin's focus on building weaponry above feeding his people. People even changed sides because they detested Stalin so much. But if he hadn't been so bloody despotic, Germany might well have won. For the invasion, Operation Barbarossa, Hitler deployed around 3.6 million troops, 2,700 aircraft, and 3,600 tanks, which was record-breaking in terms of European warfare. Stalin had 2.9 million troops, 8,000 aircraft, and 11,000 tanks, but the Germans were superior in terms of technology and general warfare. But let's think. If Germany had just defeated Britain in our fictional scenario, there would be a spring in the military step. They'd also be making use of that excellent British arms industry. For instance, in real life, Hitler had thousands of French prisoners of war slaving away in its munitions industry, plus around 650,000 French civilian laborers, not to mention the Vichy French fighting for Germany. Over in the USA, in real life again, many people didn't have much love for the Soviets. The famed American aviator Charles Lindbergh said at the time, "I would 100 times rather see my country ally herself with Britain or even Germany, with all her faults, than the cruelty, the godlessness, and the barbarism of the Soviet Union." There was more support for Nazism in the US than you might think. Hence, Philip Roth's alternative reality novel, The Plot Against America. The famed industrialist Henry Ford admired Nazi Germany, and he was for much of his life very much anti-Semitic, showcased in the anti-Semite books he published with titles such as The International Jew, The World's Foremost Problem. Back to our alternate reality. With the British loss and the USA hardly coming to the rescue, there is every chance that Germany could have won Russia, especially if its ally, for the short term anyway, was Japan, who would also attack Russia. Just think, with Britain defeated, Japan wouldn't have to fight the country in Singapore, Hong Kong, and what were the Malaya and Burma. We also have to remember about the impact of all the countries of the British Empire that fought alongside Britain. Think about British India and the massive impact it had on the war, or India alone, whose 2.5 million troops fought under British command. Think about Canada, which couldn't have fought on since it was a dominion of the British Empire, or even Australia, who, although they didn't join the war effort right away, still provided the Brits with manpower and resources. We understand this is overly simplistic, and we haven't even discussed any country's atomic bomb research, but let's just say after Britain fell, the invasion of Russia went as Hitler planned. It was over within the year. This really could have happened had things just been a bit different. What would the USA be thinking now after much of Europe and some of Asia had fallen to Adolf Hitler and Japan? As we said, Americans didn't want to fight a European war. William Kaplan, the then head of Harvard, said as much, one time stating, "Hitler's going to win, let's be friends with him." Many people thought this way, of course. They weren't fully aware of Hitler's plans for world domination and the sheer ugliness of what he was capable of. Still, the US had meddled in the war by freezing assets and preventing Japan from getting the oil it needed to attempt to build its empire during the war, and Japan didn't much like this American interference. The US wasn't totally out of the war, lending weapons to Britain and helping in other ways, all for a price, of course. But then companies such as GM, Ford, and IBM also sold what was described as useful war materials to Germany. The US made hay while bombs spilled down on Europe, coming out of the war much richer. It might have stayed that way if Japan hadn't launched the famous attack. Japan had hoped that after attacking the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, the US would revert to its isolationist policies. In our alternate reality, the US had watched on as Germany's Operation Barbarossa was successful and Britain and France were a spent force. In this case, had the Pearl Harbor attack happened, the US might well not have retaliated. But then, had history been different, the US might not have interfered one bit and the attack on Pearl Harbor wouldn't have happened in the first place. And that's how things are different in our alternate world. So right now, Hitler's over the moon. The problem is he has enemies everywhere in his vanquished countries. This is why he's sending out death squads to hunt down the people he doesn't like. For this, he deploys mobile death squads, aka the Einsatzgruppen. They scour German-occupied Europe looking for their victims, and that includes the Jewish people, communists, gypsies, anti-fascists, and even intellectuals. Hitler didn't leave all the work to his death squad, though. He prepared a list in 1940 of what he perceived to be dangerous Brits, kept in his Black Book. He is very well aware that he is much despised by a lot of people in occupied Britain. The French had a resistance, but it was small and only really significant close to the end of the war. Still, there would have been resistance in Britain too. This Black Book contained 2,820 names, from Jews to journalists to anti-fascists to spies to politicians to academics and novelists, all to be immediately arrested once Britain was successfully invaded. This book can give you some idea about what would have happened if Hitler had won the war. There are some names in the book that would surprise you, including the great writer Aldous Huxley. If Hitler had won in England, the writer of the book Brave New World might not have had the chance in 1949 to congratulate George Orwell on his dystopian novel 1984. We very much doubt he would have written to Orwell saying, "Within the next generation, I believe that the world's leaders will discover that infant conditioning is more efficient as instruments of government than clubs and prisons, by flogging them and kicking them into obedience." He was right, as it turned out in the long run. Anyway, Hitler was doing a lot of flogging and kicking in the UK, and perhaps Huxley, as well as other British intellectuals who liked the idea of freedom, would have been sent to Nazi extermination camps. These Brits had no idea they were on Hitler's hit list. With the playwright Noel Coward writing after the war, "If anyone had told me at the time that I was high up on the Nazi blacklist, I should have laughed and told them not to talk nonsense." For the most part, no one really understood what Hitler would do to secure his vision of a Nazi-led utopia. In Britain as well as in the Soviet Union, Jews, gypsies, communists, certain kinds of intellectuals are sent to labor camps to work or die in the process. Young and fit people in Britain, as well as Russia, would be drafted to work for the Nazi war machine and its general industries. This machine has to expand. After all, Hitler has the USA in his sights. The country now wondering if Churchill had been right and if they should have helped out earlier when Germany was more vulnerable. Meanwhile, Britain adopts a new government in line with the Nazi regime. That is, an authoritarian, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic government led by Oswald Mosley, whose British Union of Fascists had just been resurrected after being disbanded in 1940. Not too many years earlier, Hitler had kept a keen eye on Mosley, impressed when he said things such as, "For the first time I openly and publicly challenged the Jewish interests of this country, commanding commerce, commanding the press, commanding the cinema, dominating the city of London, killing industry with their sweatshops." And now with Hitler at the helm and his man Mosley in England, the German propaganda machine goes into hyperdrive. What's astounding is how quickly many people in Britain embrace what Mosley is saying. He promises an end to corrupt banking, telling them the upper classes have kept them in bondage for centuries. Soon thugs like the old king and church mob squash any resistance to the British fascists. People are afraid to speak out against fascism. Progressives are hunted down, and something similar is happening in Russia. The Russian Fascist Party has never been that big. But now with Stalin and almost all of the Politburo exterminated or in labor camps, and with the Germans releasing many thousands of Soviet prisoners from gulags, a lot of people start to believe the Nazi propaganda. Millions had died under Stalin. Millions more had been on the verge of starvation or been sent to gulags, and generally lived in fear. That's why it doesn't take long for these deeply oppressed people to embrace another form of government, one that promises a better society. As time goes on, while Germany focuses much of its efforts on industry and taking back the African colonies that had been taken away after the First World War, something strange is happening in the USA. The German propaganda machine under Joseph Goebbels is incredibly effective, even far away in the US. The mass exterminations have been kept away from the world's eyes for the most part, despite the rumors and in spite of the spying. The US public doesn't know about those wicked massacres of innocent people. So now the Nazis spew out propaganda regarding how their New World Order is rescuing people from out-of-control capitalist slavery and releasing them from the chains that they say the Jewish elite have placed on them. A worrying number of people are taking interest in the fascist movement in the US. Remember, this is a country where a massive part of the poorer population has just gone through absolute hell during the Great Depression. Hitler blames all that on the Jews. And when leading fascism supporters in the US talk, some of the American people listen, as they also do over the border where the Canadian Union of Fascists speaks at events. Then when Charles Lindbergh stands up and promotes his America First policy, pro-fascist isolationists in the crowd cheer. These crowds just keep growing and anti-Semitic sentiment grows with it. Even though the USA is already backward when it comes to civil rights compared to other advanced nations, racism becomes even more intense throughout the nation. The fascists in the US say leave Europe to its own devices. They say any form of intervention in European affairs will likely be disastrous given the now great power of Germany. People look up to Lindenberg when he says things like this. A few far-sighted Jewish people realize this and stand opposed to intervention, but the majority still do not. Their greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. Remember, this guy is a national hero. When he speaks, many people are glued to his every word. The US government has awarded this famed aviator the Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Flying Cross, but now the Nazis have also given him a medal, namely the Commander Cross of the Order of the German Eagle. The Nazis know that Lindbergh and Ford, two of the most powerful men in America, often discuss what they and the Nazis call the Jewish problem. Perhaps Hitler thinks Germany doesn't need to attack the US at its borders. Perhaps he can take control from within the borders, with the help of an American fascist party working on his behalf. Hitler muses that it isn't as if this country of Mongols doesn't already have widespread white supremacy. America can quite easily be pushed over the edge, he assumes. Those he calls the mongrels will once again be enslaved and the Jewish will be executed. The racial segregation that already exists in the US will just be taken up a notch. Hitler once said that the US military posed no threat, but he has changed his mind as of late. Invading the US, he knows, is an almost impossible task, even though part of him believes the country's military is weak due to its racial diversity. He writes in his diary one day that he'd like nothing more than to see New York in flames. Japan has already been granted part of the former Soviet Union, and the country is certainly up for an invasion of the US. But will it work? The months pass, the year ticks over, and the power of the Nazis just grows and grows. Now with so much European industry in its control, and an army like the world has never seen, the US is a David to the Goliath of Germany. And this is why the isolationists in the US win over so many of the people. War will mean mass death. It will mean certain defeat. Why not, just as so many have said in the past, be on good terms with Hitler? Do some trade with him. To become his enemy is a death sentence, and finance-wise, it makes no sense at all. Hitler contemplates on the costs of a long-distance invasion, but even with British ships now under his control, taking that many men across the sea is a Herculean task. Feeding those men, getting the fuel for the machines, moving all that equipment across the ocean just seems like a bridge too far. But if the Canadian fascists, who are now gaining popularity like the British fascists have, go for a war, a land invasion against the so-called decadent capitalists can happen overland from Canada. It will take time and the movement of many resources, not to mention it would also be very risky. Things aren't looking good for the US. Damn, think a lot of people. If the UK had only been able to repel Germany, none of this would have happened. That little island losing to the Nazis had changed the entire outcome of the history of the world. Then, one day Hitler's sitting at his desk and he receives a report that has taken months to compile. The report states that throughout Europe an estimated 9.7 million Jews have been exterminated. It also states that 350,000 homosexuals have been killed, along with close to 840,000 Romani and Sinti people. Things have moved much faster since Europe was defeated by Hitler. The report doesn't state how many disabled people have died in the camps, although Hitler is pleased when he reads that they're being used for various medical experiments. People of color, says the report, as well as intellectuals, are mostly being employed in slave labor activities, although many have also been exterminated. Meanwhile, scientists working in the USA are making headway with an atomic bomb project. Little do they know that if they could have collaborated with scientists in Britain, the project would almost be complete. Now Hitler has control over Britain's project, seeing that under Mosley, Britain is nothing more than a German puppet state. It also helps that former King Edward VIII has been restored to the throne, a much more suitable monarch for the Nazis than George VI. But what about life in general in this new Europe? Hitler believes that he can create a utopian society, but it's only possible when the people he thinks have caused the world's problems are all dead, man, woman, and child. He hates religion, but in his new empire he actually endorses religious tolerance. This is more out of fear of mass resistance than anything else. He also promotes selective polygamy, believing that if you mix the right genes you will create the right products for his army, for his science projects, for his idea of societal harmony. At times this is oppressive for women, who are usually the ones selected. Strangely, for a man with so much blood on his hands, Hitler detests cruelty to animals and even endorses but not enforces national vegetarianism. At the same time, he abhors what he calls degenerative art, and he hates the artists just as much, even if they do tick the right box for his so-called master race. He bans pornography in Germany as well as prostitution, some intellectual pursuits, certain kinds of writing and poetry, decadent music, excessive boozing, and smoking. His puppet states are not asked to conform to these ideals, but in many cases, the new fascists around Europe espouse and enforce the ideals of the Nazis. In some ways, those who follow Hitler do see some benefits. Even some businesses and industries improve since Hitler has taken a zero-tolerance stand against corruption. The totalitarian ways, he says, must be simple and without deceits. It is also horribly oppressive and leads to unhappiness that people try not to show. Just as one critic over in the US says, the utopia that Hitler seeks can never be free from tyranny. Anyone who says they don't like this new paradise will be severely punished. The guy who writes that is soon beaten up by one of the now widespread pro-fascist mobs in the US. The year is now 1944. For some time, British scientists have been working on an atomic bomb under the Tube Alloys Project, something that has been kept secret from everyone except those who need to know in Canada. The project was actually started before the USA's Manhattan Project. The Brits had forecast a bomb not being ready until 1947, but once the new German and Soviet scientists joined the project and the Germans have more facilities with the newly built heavy bombers and a hell of a lot more money to make bombs, the project is completed in 1944. But the US Manhattan Project is also just about ready. Little do the world's public know that a nightmare situation is taking place. In 1945, both sides test their bombs, and so it is now known just how much destructiveness is in the hands of leaders, and more concerning in the hands of a man who thinks very little of American mongrels. The strange thing is Hitler, despite the fact that he's gassed millions of people, does not embrace the use of superweapons. He's even held off on using chemical weapons, even though the Germans at the start of the war had a huge stockpile of deadly sarin gas. So it's not so surprising that he doesn't like the thought of using an atomic bomb. As for the US, it was well aware of what's coming back if it drops a bomb. And why would it when Hitler has not yet made it clear he will invade the US? As crazy as Hitler is, he doesn't want to die. He doesn't want his idea of utopia to be destroyed. Still, if something doesn't change in the US, he might have to do something. This Cold War stalemate creates a frenzy among the public, especially the American public, that according to the polls, do not want to go to war with Hitler. It's during this next chaotic year that Lindbergh creates the American Fascist Party to be sympathetic with Nazi ethos, but with an assurance from Hitler that Germany will not interfere in American affairs. So, how does Hitler finally win this war? It's when fascism wins in the USA, when fear, bitterness, anger, and stupidity push people to polls to tick the box under American Fascist Party. Some of the poor just want change, and rightly so. But out of desperation, political distrust, and lack of options, they unwittingly choose their own demise. Lindbergh has assured that no Americans will be harmed in relation to their race or creed, but already an ugliness has seeped into a once hopeful culture. Gangs roam the streets at night, throwing Molotov cocktails through house windows. The police don't do much to stop it. This will only get worse. Families of Jewish people, African Americans, and other minorities for that matter huddle together in living rooms and shed tears when they watch Lindbergh throw his fist into the air on his victory. It is a victory for Hitler just as much. America closes its doors to the world, but also inside the house something is rotten. No structure can remain standing when the foundations are warped and decayed. Totalitarianism will eat itself and suppresses natural creativity, and with it societal progress. It foments distrust and paranoia, and in that time leads to widespread violence and unhappiness. One day, goodness and morality and love and compassion among races will win out, and that rotten house will fall down. But for now, the present is Hitler's utopia, hell on earth, even for most of the ones who've asked for it. Hitler was an incredibly rich man when he wrote his last will and testament in the bunker where he would take his life. He had amassed a fortune from the sales of Mein Kampf, business deals, and private investments. But who got Hitler's money after his death? What else was in his will? And could there be a massive fortune hidden away somewhere waiting to be found? As Nazi Germany fell during the end of World War II, Hitler committed suicide and transferred his power to other members of the Nazi regime. But before he did this, he wrote a will. There were 3 copies of the will distributed, and all that might have been lost to time if it not had been for a British intelligence officer named Hermann Rothman. He was deployed to Germany to interrogate high-level Nazi officials for information. While on assignment, he spotted a suspicious man dressed in civilian clothing. Rothman decided something didn't seem right, and that the man warranted further investigation. He discovered the German man was carrying falsified documents. It turned out the imposter was Heinz Lorenz. Lorenz was the press secretary for Joseph Goebbels, the man who was made Chancellor of Nazi Germany by Hitler just before he committed suicide. Sewn into one of the seams of Lorenz's jacket were 3 documents. They were a final political statement written by Hitler himself, a document written by Goebbels, and Hitler's will. As you might expect, the political statement was wildly racist against the Jewish people. Hitler blamed them for his own shortcomings and for causing Nazi Germany to lose the war, thus reinforcing what a lunatic Hitler was. But what was in his will? Who got his fortune? The first thing Hitler talks about in his will is his new wife, Eva Braun. Up until right before their double suicide, Eva and Adolf were not yet married. Eva was the aide to Hitler's official photographer. They first met during a photo shoot of the Führer. Hitler and Braun developed a relationship and when opportunities presented themselves, spent time alone together. Hitler explained in his will that he was too busy to marry, and that was why they did it right before their deaths. Some scholars have their own theories about why Hitler waited so long to marry Braun, but according to Hitler's will, at the end of April 1945, the two were joined in matrimony. Hitler goes on to declare that Eva Braun made the decision under her own free will to commit suicide with him. Whether this is true or not, we'll never know, but in his will, Hitler claims this to be the case. In the next part of his will, Hitler discusses what will happen to his belongings and money. He states that everything he possesses and has any value should be given to the Nazi Party. However, Hitler writes it in a way that seems as if he doesn't own much of anything. This is far from the truth, as he had amassed a fortune from the sales of Mein Kampf, as well as through royalties on images of himself and business deals. Hitler continues by saying that if the Nazi Party does not survive, that his belongings should be given to the state. And if the state does not survive, then all is lost and his wishes are no longer necessary. Hitler does not make specific arrangements for his paintings and pictures, which he had collected over the years. They were to be given to Linz, Austria, the town in which he grew up. There, he also wanted the art to be displayed in a gallery for the public, and not as a private collection. It's in the next part of the will that Hitler mentions his money, yet he still does not acknowledge the massive sum he's accumulated over the course of his rise to power. Hitler gives Martin Bormann, his private secretary and Nazi official, full legal authority to make decisions based on his will. Hitler states that everything of sentimental value and the funds necessary for a modest life should be given to his brothers and sisters. However, it would seem his own family was not quite as important as someone else. Hitler goes on to say that, above all, Eva Braun's mother should be taken care of. He was more intentional in including her directly in his will than his own family. This seems odd, but then again, Hitler was an odd man. He also put in his will that of all his faithful co-workers, particularly his secretary Frau Winter, should be looked after as well. There is no specific number or amount of money each should receive, which means it was up to the discretion of Bormann. However, we know that Hitler's fortune was massive, so if his last will and testament was followed, there was a hefty sum of money that could have been distributed among the parties described in the will. Hitler concludes his will by saying that he and his now wife Eva Braun would rather escape disgrace by choosing death over being captured. He also included that once he took Eva's life and then his own, their bodies were to be immediately burned. He signed the will given in Berlin, 29th of April 1945, 4 a.m., A. Hitler. Below his name, the three witnesses of the will are signed as well. They were Dr. Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and Colonel Nicholas von Below. It was not a very long will and did not contain many specifics, but it did give us a glimpse into what would happen to Hitler's belongings once he took his own life. However, this begs the question, what really happened to all of Hitler's possessions and money? The surprising thing is, we aren't entirely sure. We know for a fact that Mein Kampf made Hitler very rich. By the time of his death in 1945, the book had sold about 8 million copies and had been translated into 16 languages. It was estimated that Hitler earned around $1 million per year in royalties. Some of this money was used to buy his Alpine retreat, named the Berghof, which was located near the town of Berchtesgaden in Germany. This was not a cheap estate, so Hitler must have spent a significant amount of money on it. He also felt he had enough money that once he became Führer, he forewent the salary associated with the position. In Mein Kampf and other writings, Hitler talked about his earlier life in poverty and hardship. He was a struggling artist in Vienna before fighting in World War I and the publication of his influential book. He talked about how he overcame all odds to succeed and made enough money to live comfortably. Once he had money, it was reported that he spent millions on gifts and payments to buy the loyalty of politicians and businessmen. The payments would allow him to be able to call in favors and make others dependent on him. Obviously, this would not have been possible without a massive sum of money. Once he became Führer, Hitler no longer thought of there being a divide between his personal money and that of the Nazi Party. He would use funds from both his own wealth and the state to buy property, art, and make business deals. It's also well established that before becoming the Führer, Hitler was a tax evader. He was in debt through back taxes until he rose to power. And once in power, the money continued to flow into his pockets. Big businesses would make huge contributions to his efforts, so they could secure military and infrastructure contracts. It's estimated that from the time he started as chancellor until his suicide in 1945, Hitler received over $3 billion in corporate payments. So what happened to all of Hitler's money? Is it still out there in the world waiting to be discovered? In his will, Hitler says he wanted all his property and wealth to go to the Nazi Party. However, we know that the Nazis were defeated, and therefore the will defaults to the next beneficiary, which was the state. In a way, the state did get much of Hitler's wealth. At the end of the war, the Allies gave the copyrights of Mein Kampf to the Bavarian government. There was still a lot of potential money that could have been brought in by owning the copyrights to the book. However, the government banned any reprinting of the work in Germany, and therefore those funds stopped coming in. Both Hitler's Berghof estate in the Alps and his apartment in Munich were also given to Bavaria. So it would seem that a lot of Hitler's assets did actually go to the state like he wanted in his will. However, most of this was in the form of physical and intellectual property. What happened to the expensive art collections and actual money? There are accounts of Hitler's house in the Alps being bombed by Allied forces and then looted by the soldiers. It's possible that much of the artwork that Hitler had collected was stolen during this time. We also don't know exactly what was in Hitler's house when it was raided. We know the Nazis liked to create secret passages and bunkers. If there were such secrets within Berghof, perhaps the soldiers who found them were able to get away with the money and other valuables. In 1952, what remained of Hitler's Berghof house was blown up by the Bavarian government to keep it from attracting tourists and people who might have still shared Hitler's ideologies. With the destruction of the house, anything that might have been hidden within would have been lost. Hitler's apartment in Munich is still there, but it's been converted to a police station instead of a residence. So it would seem that the Bavarian government did in fact receive some of Hitler's possessions as per his will. However, when trying to follow the actual money and where it went, things become a bit unclear. Since his fortune was so intertwined with the money of the Nazi Party, it's possible that much of his wealth was spent on the war effort at the end of World War II. That being said, it is possible that some of the money and valuables that once belonged to Hitler were smuggled out of Nazi Germany by deserters and officers trying to escape Allied forces. Yes, it's possible. However, we may never know how much of Hitler's fortune was disseminated this way. Hitler knew he would lose World War II, and rather than being tried for his crimes, decided to take his own life and that of his brand new bride. Just before he committed suicide, Hitler did write a will, and in it he laid out what to do with his possessions, but he was somewhat vague about the extent of his actual wealth in the document. It would seem that most of what Hitler owned went to the Bavarian state. However, his fortune is not completely accounted for. Perhaps some of Hitler's money and valuables are still out there waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps everything he had and owned was lost or plundered during the war that he started. Conspiracy theories have been running rampant recently. Sometimes they can be harmless, other times they can cause serious confusion. What would happen if the most evil man in history didn't die the way we thought he had? What if Adolf Hitler actually escaped his fate and was able to live out his life in relative peace? It's unthinkable, yet some people believe this is what happened. The conventional theory is that Hitler took his own life by cyanide and a gunshot to the head in a Berlin bunker as Soviet forces closed in from all sides. But another theory has been floating around for decades, that Hitler actually escaped Germany and fled to Argentina, where he lived out the rest of his days in secret. Is there any evidence to support this escape theory? Where did this theory even start? Let's find out. Hitler's death is recorded as being April 30th, 1945. On May 1st, 1945, Supreme Commander of the Navy, Admiral Karl Donitz, who was designated successor to Hitler, officially announced the death of the Führer. That same year, the war came to an end in Europe, and British counterintelligence officer Hugh Trevor Roper was tasked with determining the actual cause of death for Adolf Hitler. To this point in time, the Soviet forces were the only ones in Berlin who had access to the remains of Hitler, and they were not very forthcoming with the details of the Führer's death. Not only were the Soviets shady about releasing the information on what happened to Hitler, but since they refused to hand over any remains or evidence as to what happened to the Nazi leader, rumors started to circulate. Even Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, was recorded as mentioning that perhaps Hitler had escaped to Argentina after all. This had Hugh Trevor Roper worried. He needed to get to the bottom of what actually happened to the leader of the Axis powers. And as he dug deeper, Trevor Roper found that the disorganization of the Soviets was part of the problem. They may not have been withholding information so much as just misplacing or not knowing where things were. All Trevor Roper knew at this point in time was that the Soviets possessed a statement of Hitler's death. They had conducted an investigation at the bunker where the suicide took place 2 days after it happened, and they had captured key members of the Nazi Party who claimed to be eyewitnesses to the events in said bunker. Trevor Roper worried that the lack of evidence the Soviets were providing may have somehow been motivated by the beginnings of the Cold War. The Soviets may have been posturing and taking credit for Hitler's death as a show of power. Without concrete evidence, Trevor Roper could not be sure. It did not help that the Soviet leaders were uncooperative or forthcoming with information pertaining to Hitler's death. Trevor Roper would wait long periods of time before questions were answered, or any tangible evidence was provided. Again, it did not help that the leadership of the Soviet Union was doing very little in public statements to dissuade any conspiracy theories about Hitler's death or provide the public with concrete information to prove that Hitler had killed himself in a bunker. In a public address, Soviet Marshal Zhukov and Colonel General Berzarin went as far as to speculate that perhaps Hitler had escaped from the bunker and was hiding out in Spain. It seemed that even the communication with the Soviet leadership was in conflict, so it was no wonder that Trevor Roper couldn't obtain clear evidence. The British intelligence officer was unable to make sense of the messaging or lack of the evidence and concluded that it might have been a tactic used to create suspicion and distrust among Allied forces. This would leave the Soviet Union in a more powerful position as the Cold War started to unfurl. Trevor Roper himself even said, "The infallible Stalin had declared the truth, before which the inconvenient evidence must bow and retire," meaning this misinformation campaign could all be a matter of Stalinist orthodoxy to further the Soviet agenda. Trevor Roper would leave Germany empty-handed with only speculation and the word of the Soviets that Hitler was in fact dead. The alternative was unthinkable, but the messaging was mixed and there was no official documents or remains handed over to the British intelligence officer to come to a concrete conclusion. In fact, it would take until 1968 until the Soviets divulged the information that resulted from the detailed investigation they'd conducted at the bunker. The results of the investigation were finally made public, and the cause of Hitler's death as suicide could be confirmed, at least for the time being. So it would seem that the theory that Hitler had escaped with his wife Eva Braun to Argentina started as early as 1945 by the Soviets right after the war in Europe ended. But there were other aspects that fueled the fire of this conspiracy theory. Even in the United States, people started believing that American intelligence officials allowed Hitler to escape in return for advanced Nazi technology. In 1945, British newspapers repeated the comments of disinformation from the leaders of the Soviet Union, creating a sense of uncertainty as to what actually happened to Hitler. The papers even reported that the charred body discovered by the Soviets in the bunker was actually a very poor double of the Führer. This rhetoric led to several wild conspiracy theories about Hitler's escape. Some claimed he went to Argentina or Spain, others that he somehow made it to the moon and built a Nazi empire there. However, all credible historians agree that Hitler killed himself on April 30, 1945 in Berlin. Is there any real evidence to contradict the historical account of what happened to Adolf Hitler? Some rogue researchers would argue that several lines of evidence point to Hitler fleeing to Argentina instead of meeting his ultimate demise in Berlin. There were declassified FBI documents that contained a number of alleged sightings of Hitler after he was supposed to have died. However, mustaches similar to Hitler's, think Charlie Chaplin, were in fashion during the time, and people's eyes and brain can trick them into seeing things that are not actually there. Just think of how many people see a man's face on the moon. Also, the FBI made public statements saying that the sightings of Hitler could not be verified in any credible way. Some other rogue researchers used lack of evidence early on to suggest that Hitler's body was never actually found. This meant that he must have escaped. Unfortunately, forensic methods at the time of Hitler's death were not as advanced as they are today, but recently forensic anthropologists and scientists have gone back to analyze the bone fragments and teeth of Hitler that are housed in Russia. Their findings are very interesting. More recently, the theory that Hitler escaped to Argentina became popular again in 2014 with a book called The Grey Wolf. It seemed like around this time there was no shortage of conspiracy theory shows circulating the television networks or books being published. The book Grey Wolf was researched and written by the British authors Simon Dunstan and Gerard Williams. The authors proposed that rather than Hitler killing Eva Braun and himself, he faked their deaths, boarded a U-boat accompanied by a high-ranking Nazi official and treasures collected during the war, and made their way to South America. The authors claimed that Hitler already had connections to the future president of Argentina, Juan Perón, who had received money from the Nazis during World War II. In Grey Wolf, Hitler makes a daring escape, crosses the Atlantic completely undetected, sails around the tip of South America, and lands in Argentina. He moves around for a bit and then settles to live out the rest of his life quietly and happily, two things that Adolf Hitler was not known for. The book claims Hitler actually died in February of 1962. Just thinking about Hitler's personality, it seems that he would not have been able to contain his enthusiasm for destruction and genocide. He most likely would have tried to carry out this vision of a Third Reich in South America. But like the entirety of the Grey Wolf book, this is just speculation. Dunstan and Williams explained that it may have been possible for Hitler to fund his escape using the treasures he stole from around the world. He may have even been the wealthiest person on the planet during the height of World War II. The funds would have been used to hire the men he needed to flee to Argentina and keep everyone silent about his plans by paying them off. Again, all the evidence that Grey Wolf presents is tentative at best and easily disprovable at worst. In fact, the authors were accused by Argentinian researcher and author Abel Basti for plagiarizing his work. Basti claims that his research was used by Dunstan and Williams without citing him properly. He also claims that they misrepresented some of his research in their book. Basti signed a contract with Williams stating that he would introduce the author to 2 key witnesses that would provide credibility to his theory. Basti held up his end of the bargain but was never paid by Williams. It doesn't bode well for the reliability of Dunstan and Williams that they used people in Argentina to try to fit evidence into their theory instead of allowing the evidence to speak for itself and coming to a logical conclusion. It also doesn't seem like Dunstan and Williams treated people they hired or other researchers with respect, but that's just an observation. Regardless, Grey Wolf was torn apart by historians and established World War II researchers as soon as it came out. There was no actual evidence in the book that could prove the theory of Hitler escaping to Argentina or contradict history. Around the same time as Grey Wolf, the History Channel premiered a series called Hunting Hitler. The show claimed to have uncovered previously classified documents of interviews with witnesses who claimed Hitler escaped from Germany and traveled to Argentina by U-boat. However, upon scrutiny of the documents by historians, they were debunked. This was not discussed on the Hunting Hitler TV show, which probably led to people further spreading unsubstantiated claims that Hitler made it to Argentina. This brings us to the end of the journey down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories about Adolf Hitler escaping to Argentina. So what really happened to Adolf Hitler, and how do we know? That answer is simple. Hitler killed Eva Braun and himself in the Berlin bunker, just like historians have maintained all these years. We know this from several lines of evidence, but it's also okay to trust the experts in their field. Historians have their work peer-reviewed and scrutinized over by other academics. When experts in the field come to a consensus, it's a safe bet you can believe them. But if you want even more evidence that Hitler committed suicide, here you go. In a recent study, French scientists analyzed the fragments of Hitler's teeth that are kept secured in Russia. We know they're his teeth because experts scoured dental records from the Nazi regime and found multiple copies of Adolf Hitler's dental files. The teeth the Russians have are an exact match. At the time of death, Hitler only had 4 real teeth remaining, which are all in very bad shape. Upon analysis, the scientists confirmed that the residue and deterioration of the teeth are consistent with the vegetarian diet that Adolf Hitler ate. They also concluded that Hitler did in fact take cyanide before the gunshot to his head, but it's still unclear if it was enough of the poison to have killed him on his own. Experts have examined the teeth and fragments of the skull, concluded that the remains belonged to Hitler, and as the Soviet reports indicated, he was killed by a gunshot wound to the head. All of the evidence corroborates what historians have known for decades. Hitler committed suicide in a Berlin bunker on April 30, 1945. As it turns out, Hitler's escape to Argentina was just a fabricated myth. It may have just started as a misinformation campaign by Stalin and the leaders of the Soviet Party, or it could have just developed from the media and public wanting a little more excitement in their lives. Either way, there is no concrete evidence to support the escape to Argentina conspiracy theory, and there's ample amount of evidence to support what experts have been saying all along. Hitler committed suicide. The villain stares up at the plans for the powerful weapon. This is no ordinary gun or rocket. When complete, it'll harness the power of the sun itself and rain fire and death down on his enemies. A mad scientist looking for revenge on a superhero? No, the villain was Nazi leader Adolf Hitler, and this weapon and many others were really built or planned by his scientists. What was the Wunderwaffe? The secret German program of wonder weapons? It was 1942 and the Nazi war machine was flagging. The United States had entered the war. The United Kingdom was stubbornly refusing to fall, and Hitler had the brilliant idea of invading Russia, which meant the German army now had to fight a war on 2 fronts. The morale of the military was fading. Hitler was devoting more and more resources toward targeting German citizens, and even many of his own generals were starting to whisper. Was the Führer losing his marbles? Did Germany need a change in leadership? Naturally, that meant there was only one thing to do: turn up the propaganda. Led by Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda ministry started putting out news that would help turn the tide of the war. Because Germany's scientists were on the case and they were designing a whole new crop of Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapons, that the world had never seen before. These weapons, straight out of science fiction in some cases, were said to pack a power the world has never seen. 3 years before the first atomic bombs were perfected, these secret weapons were said to turn the tide of any war and send the enemy running. So, was there any truth to these announcements? As usual, the answer is yes and no. The Germans did in fact have a top-secret weapons program, and it was led by some of the world's best scientists. Men like Werner von Braun, the aerospace engineer who was later taken out of Germany by the United States and became one of the heads of the space program, regularly presented Hitler with blueprints for wildly ambitious weapons. The only thing standing between Germany and unleashing these beasts on the battlefield was a lack of time and money, and Hitler was more than willing to give both of these to the Wunderwaffe program. and the results were impressive, at least on paper. The Wunderwaffe program went for quantity over quality in many cases, and they delivered designs and prototypes for countless new weapons. Some delivered the foundation of future weapons and innovations that swept the world. Others were created but didn't live up to the initial hype. Still others were designed on paper, but the German army ran out of time before they became a reality. And yet others turned into complete and total disasters that we still marvel at today. Let's crack open the secret files of the Wunderwaffe and see which of these innovations succeeded and which terrified even Hitler. Germany had an impressive navy, but they were far behind the Allied powers in one area: aircraft carriers. Hitler wanted to expand Germany's naval power far beyond Europe, and to do that, they needed much more capacity. So they commissioned the Graf Zeppelin, a massive carrier that could have carried over 40 fighter planes and dive bombers. And it was one of the earliest Wunderwaffe projects, beginning construction in 1936, and it was still under construction in 1945. With Germany's defeat imminent, the ship was deliberately sunk to avoid it falling into enemy hands. It was later salvaged and used for weapons tests by the Soviets, a far cry from the powerhouse it was intended to be. But it wasn't the most impressive aircraft carrier in the Nazis' plans. The German ocean liner Europa was an impressive ship, one of the largest of the era. After losing a key battleship in 1941, the German Navy needed an aircraft carrier they could use quickly. So they came up with the idea, why not turn the cruise ship into a carrier? The largest of the vessels was chosen for conversion. The Europa was redesigned the German Aircraft Carrier 1, and big plans were developed to convert it. And that's all they became, plans. Soon after the process began, it became clear there were serious structural weaknesses, and the ship wasn't meant to carry airplanes. It wound up carrying troops after it was seized by the United States. If there was one thing the Wunderwaffe program loved, it was large ships. It was called Plan Z, the plan to expand and enhance the German Navy starting in 1939. The plans were always ambitious, but never quite panned out, and that included the H-class battleships. Never heard of the H-class battleships? That's because they were designed to be by far the largest the German Navy had ever seen, with 6 ships loaded with massive guns and reinforced deck armor. Ironically, what spelled their end was the very thing they were designed for: World War II. The Navy's focus went to retrofitting existing ships, and the H-class battleships faded off into the seas of fantasy. But one section of the German Navy got much more attention. The U-boat was the terror of the seas, as the German submarines sank countless Allied ships, but Hitler wanted them to be faster, stronger, and deadlier. Countless new models were proposed, starting with the rocket U-boat. Most U-boats use standard torpedoes, but these blueprints intended to replace that with higher-powered rockets and missiles. This would allow the Germans to not only sink enemy ships more effectively, but potentially launch attacks on Britain and even the United States from the sea. The first tests were promising, but the lack of a guidance system made them ineffective. Ultimately, the rocket U-boat wasn't ready for combat by the time the war ended, but the scientists continued to refine them for other countries. There was a constant quest to upgrade the U-boat, and some got closer than others. The biggest challenge of using submarines in combat was that they weren't meant to stay underwater at length. They had to coast along the surface and could only submerge for short periods at a time. The Type 21 submarines aimed to change that, being the first ships to operate primarily underwater and only need to resurface for charging. The prototypes worked, and they were put into production in a hurry. Over 100 were completed and 2 were put into service, but at that point the sea war of the European front was all but over. Neither ship saw combat, but the design was impressive enough that both the US and USSR built on it in the future. But the designs that were meant for the surface were no less ambitious or strange. The Kugelblitz might sound like a falling rain of noodle puddings, but the World War II reality was much different. A planned anti-aircraft weapon, it was a self-propelled gun that would be attached to tanks and had the ability to shoot down enemy planes from the ground. It was the first model to have an enclosed rotating turret that would give it far greater maneuverability. The plans were approved to move it to the prototype phase, but that's where the project concluded as the war ended and only a few test vehicles had been completed. The only surviving turret stands on display at a German Army museum. But to take down tanks, the German Army would need some bigger guns. Literally. A rare example of a Wunderwaffe weapon that actually saw combat, the Sturer Emil anti-tank gun was an impressive beast. A lengthy run mounted on the hull of an armored tank, it could carry 15 rounds and move enough to aim effectively. The tank design was adjusted from standard heavy tanks to balance the huge barrel, and 2 models were completed and sent into the field. Named after Max and Moritz, a pair of German storybook characters, they both fell in combat, with Max being destroyed and Moritz being captured by the Soviets and placed on display in the Kubinka Tank Museum. And to carry a heavy gun, you need a heavy tank. The German heavy tank programs cranked out powerful weapons, but they wanted to go bigger. The largest tank at the time, the Panzer VII Maus, was under 200 tons. However, the planned Land Cruiser Ratte was going to weigh a whopping 1,000 tons. Its armor would be almost 10 inches thick and covered with anti-aircraft guns along with a gun turret harvested from a battleship. Hitler was impressed with the wild ambition of the project and greenlit it, always being a fan of showy weapons. However, Minister of Armaments Albert Speer saw it for what it was, a massive money pit, and canceled the project in 1943 before it was built. Other tanks were less ambitious but no more effective. Although the Land Cruiser Ratte was never completed, its smaller cousin, the famous Panzer VIII Maus, was. The behemoth of a tank still holds the record for the heaviest fully enclosed armored vehicle ever created. Over 30 feet long and almost 12 feet high, weighing in at just under 200 metric tons, it's armed with a powerful anti-tank gun. The problem was, at that size and weight, it took a lot of power to run. It could reach a top speed of up to 14 miles per hour, but it was too heavy to even cross most bridges. The tank had to ford the river using a snorkel. It was designed for power and spectacle, not maneuverability, which no doubt led to its eventual capture by the Soviet forces. But it wasn't the most bizarre tank in the Nazis' plans. You've probably seen a tumbleweed rolling down the plains. What if that tumbleweed was made of metal instead? The Nazis designed a bizarre rolling tank known as the Kugelpanzer as part of the Wunderwaffe program, but the incomplete model recovered from the field left more questions than it answered. It didn't have any weapons attached, and it seemed to be more of a mobile bunker than a tank. While it didn't seem to have much combat use, it certainly became a star exhibit in the Kubinka Tank Museum. And their plans for the air were no less ambitious. Military gliders were one of the most important parts of warfare, getting troops and supplies to where they were needed most. The Junkers Ju-332 Mammut was the largest glider the Germans tried to build, and there was a hitch to the plan. It was supposed to be built out of non-strategic material to aid the war effort, so the German Luftwaffe tried to build the entire thing out of wood. It was planned to carry up to 4,400 pounds of cargo. Early tests showed the vehicle was incredibly unstable. It landed well before its planned destination and had to be towed back, its eventual fate being cut up for fuel. One area of the German weapons program got more attention than any other. It was a constant frustration for Hitler. For all the German army's strength, he was sorely lacking in air power. Germany hadn't been involved in long-range wars before the last few decades, and their air force was dwarfed by those of the United States and Japan. They were engaged in aerial combat against Great Britain, but their planes weren't capable of striking further off targets or getting involved in the Pacific theater. The Wunderwaffe program was designed to change that, and their program had an in-your-face name, Amerika Bomber. Doesn't leave much doubt what this thing was intended to do, does it? Germany wanted a long-range bomber that would be capable of delivering a Pearl Harbor-like attack against the East Coast American cities, especially New York, which Hitler fantasized about destroying. The German Air Ministry gathered several of the country's best aircraft designers to submit their own candidates for the plane that could deliver a shocking punch to the US on their home front. The results were mixed. Ultimately, two designs stood out from the crowd and were destined for production. The first, the Messerschmitt Me-264, was a long-range strategic bomber for the Luftwaffe. It was an all-metal heavy bomber similar in design to the B-52 and had relatively little in the way of armor and guns, so it could carry more bombs. 3 prototypes were built and overall impressed the brass, but Messerschmitt was already under a lot of demand for their fighter planes, and so the project was abandoned and the competitor was chosen. And that competitor packed its own impressive payload. Junkers might have had a flop with its massive wooden glider, but their other models were anything but. The Junkers Ju-390 was the model ultimately chosen for the Amerika Bomber project for one main reason. It could be adapted from some of their existing planes. Extra inner wing segments were added to the classic Junkers Ju-90 and 290 models, and they quickly went into testing. But how successful they were is a subject of ongoing debate. Some say the test plane made secret flights to South Africa, Japan, and even New York, but there is no concrete proof of this. What's clear is that work on them continued into 1944 until their contracts were canceled, and the planes were eventually stripped for parts and destroyed. But the Nazis might have been more interested in one specific device. The future of warcraft was rockets, powerful devices that could provide fast launches from the ground and deliver massive payloads, or even take a man to the moon one day. Werner von Braun was known as the master of rockets, and many of his innovations were rocket-powered. Hundreds of designs were built for jet fighters, rocket-powered planes, bombers, ramming interceptors, and tactical bombers, but the jet fuel needed to power rockets was expensive, and the technology was new, and most of the Nazi rocket projects wound up as little more than expensive proof proof-of-concept displays for von Braun's future career. Although Hitler liked rockets, one thing's for sure, he liked heavy artillery more, and the Wunderwaffe program was happy to deliver. Why launch 100 mortars when you can launch one with 10 times the power? That was what Karl Gerhardt tried to answer. The massive siege mortar fired the largest self-propelled ammunition ever deployed, and 6 of the massive guns were built. The destination? The Eastern Front, where Russia had a massive terrain and manpower advantage over the invading Germans. The gun was even powerful enough to destroy bridges when deployed, but they were slow-moving and expensive to build. They delivered a powerful punch, but ultimately all but one were destroyed, and the remainder found its final destination at, you guessed it, the Kubinka Tank Museum. But bigger isn't always better. The Schwere Gustav was one of the most impressive guns ever built, weighing in almost 1,500 short tons and able to fire shells close to 30 miles. It was less a gun than a massive tank-like railway weapon that turned out to be the largest gun ever fired in combat. The problem is, massive guns don't just wind up where you'd like them to be without help. Getting the Schwere Gustav to where it was supposed to be took a lot of time and manpower, which gave the enemy a lot of time to surround the German position and attack. It was a powerful weapon, but not a practical one, and was eventually destroyed to keep it from falling into enemy hands. But there was one gun that would have been even more powerful. Many of the Wunderwaffe projects never left the drawing board due to a lack of money or time, and that was the case for the Land Cruiser P-1500 Monster, a super heavy self-propelled gun that would have roamed the battlefield on a pair of treads. Weighing around 1,500 tons, it would allow a massive gun like the Gustav to travel without being assembled by a team of soldiers. The problem was, well, Nazis' tank development wasn't exactly going well. Vehicles like the Maus turned out to be a disaster, so rolling a giant gun around on 2 of those wasn't likely to go smoothly. It would also be an inviting target for air attacks. The Monster was cancelled before it even got off the ground, and little documentation of it exists. Some Wunderwaffe projects were a little more practical. It was the early days of air warfare, and planes were expensive to make, so why not make them harder to shoot down? That was the goal of the Jagdfaust, an experimental anti-bomber rifle that would be equipped for German rocket planes. The Comet, the Luftwaffe's fastest plane, moved so fast that it made typical cannon rounds much harder, making accuracy a real problem for its pilots. The Jagdfaust eliminated that problem by eliminating the recoil and allowing it to be fired much faster. And unlike many German engineering projects, it worked. The gun got its first kill in April 1945. Too little, too late, as the war came to an end. The only thing more valuable than a new weapon was preserving existing ones. Losing expensive hardware was a common problem, especially when it was tanks, which the Nazis were constantly trying to upgrade. The massive weapons were especially vulnerable at night when they could be ambushed from the dark, which was why the German optics company Carl Zeiss AG developed a surprising project for the military in 1941. The FG-1250 was one of the first night vision devices ever built, working through infrared and designed to be mounted on tanks. It was one of the more effective devices, maybe proving that larger isn't always better. For many weapons, the key wasn't going bigger but smarter. It was the precursor in many ways to modern drone warfare, a weapon that wouldn't need to be aimed directly at the target but could be guided to it. The Fritz X was a powerful bomb designed to take out heavily armed targets, but what made it unique was that it was the first precision-guided weapon ever used in combat. The bomb would be guided by a radio-controlled link that affected movable parts in the tail fins and was intended to sink ships. It successfully achieved that goal in 1943, but it wouldn't be long before the Allies developed countermeasures that could interfere with the delicate radio link. Some Wunderwaffe projects, though, were distinctly closer to science fiction. It was 1929 when German physicist Hermann Oberth came up with a mad proposal, a massive space station that would use a concave mirror to concentrate sunlight and refract it back at a specific point of the Earth with devastating results. Germany was not at war at this point, so maybe he just wanted to be a supervillain. But during the Second World War, German scientists began to build on the concept. They wanted to design a massive sun gun that would generate an immense amount of energy, enough to destroy a city with a single blast. The only problem was Germany didn't have a space program. No one did. When asked how long it would take to build their sun gun, they estimated between 50 and 100 years, which, when you consider Hitler's plans for a 1,000-year Reich, might have been reasonable. But how bizarre were the projects of the Wunderwaffe truly? What was Die Glocke? The mysterious bell-shaped superweapon was one of the most mysterious supposed projects of the Wunderwaffe. It was exposed by Polish journalist Igor Witkowski in the year 2000, as he claimed he had uncovered a secret device that never saw the light of day. Some claimed the glowing contraption was an anti-gravity device, with some even saying it could be related to time travel. But in reality, all evidence is that Die Glocke was nothing. There's no evidence that Witkowski was exposing a true project instead of creating a clever tale. Other devices promises never got close to reality. The Wunderwaffe teams repeatedly came back to the idea of a directed energy weapon. Who wouldn't like a gun that never ran out of ammo, just needing to be recharged? That technology for Star Trek phasers wasn't there yet, but that didn't stop them from trying. The first attempt was a sonic cannon that could kill via high-intensity vibrations. It worked, but was too expensive and vulnerable to enemy fire to become a mainstay of combat. Undeterred, Hitler's mad scientists explored X-ray beams that could take down aircraft, but the electron accelerator they built as a test was eventually captured by the Americans. But one question has puzzled people for decades: how close did the Wunderwaffe get to the ultimate weapon? Nuclear fission was discovered in 1938, and only 4 months later, Hitler already had scientists working on a short-lived nuclear bomb project. While it was shut down shortly before the Nazi invasion of Poland, a new project would soon begin as the Nazis started producing nuclear reactors, uranium, and heavy water in earnest. The project continued to be funded until the very end of the war, but contrary to popular belief, it was not a tight race for which side got to the finish line first. While the Manhattan Project was full steam ahead, the German nuclear bomb project was understaffed, and many of the scientists left to pursue more short-term war projects. It didn't help that many of Germany's top scientists had fled the Nazi regime. In the end, the Nazi nuclear bomb project met the fate of many other superweapons, being harvested for parts by the Allies as they took over after the war. So what went wrong with the Wunderwaffe? Why did a project that created so many fantastical weapons ultimately deliver so many duds and completely fail to help the country win the war? For one thing, the scientists involved had to split their focus between so many projects that few got the opportunity to develop and be refined. Many were scrapped after one failed test. Torn between Hitler's mad ambition and Albert Speer's penny pinching, the scientists were often between a rock and a hard place. While many did change the future of warfare, few were around long enough to deliver in combat, and those that were often rolled out right before the close of the war. But one place is no doubt thankful for the Wunderwaffe, the Kubinka Tank Museum, which thanks them for many of their top exhibits. For most of World War II, Italy was Adolf Hitler's ally. But then, seemingly overnight, the Italians betrayed him. They would pay dearly for such insolence. But why did Italy betray Hitler in the first place? You'd think it'd be on moral grounds for the atrocities he committed, but that's not the real reason. In fact, from entering the war to betraying the Nazis, Italy's World War II involvement was questionably bizarre. The entrance of Italy into World War II was a little shady for a couple reasons. The first was obviously that they sided with the Nazis, but the second had to do more with the timing. When Italy joined the war, it looked like Germany was going to win. Italy had been holding out for a bit and seemed to be hedging their bets. It wasn't until Mussolini and the other members of the Italian government thought that Hitler was going to win the war that they decided to throw their support behind him. When France fell, it seemed like joining the Germans in their conquest of Europe was a safe bet. Italian leaders hoped that by joining what looked like the winning side, they would be rewarded with land and the spoils of war. It seems that Italy was more interested in gaining power for itself than the morality of what was being fought over during World War II. However, that can be said about many of the countries involved in the conflict. If the beginning of World War II had been different, and the Allies looked like they were going to win, Italy's decision of which side to join may have been very different. But that's not what happened, and in 1939, Italy signed the Pact of Steel with Germany, making them part of the Axis powers. 4 years later, on October 13, 1943, Italy would betray their former ally and switch sides to fight alongside the Allied forces to defeat Hitler. But how did they go from backing one of the world's most terrible genocidal maniacs to joining the Allies? There were several key factors, but surprisingly most had to do with the way Italy viewed itself. As soon as Italy entered World War II, they were in trouble. Benito Mussolini ruled the country as a dictator, which many people were in favor of at the time. What the Italians seemed to want more than anything else was a powerful Italy. Mussolini was the man who promised he could provide this, so much of the population went along with his fascist agenda. One of the many problems Mussolini had with running the country and fighting the war was that he cared more about loyalty than experience when it came to appointing generals and military leaders. This led to some dire consequences for Italy during World War II and was the first step in what would eventually lead to their betrayal of Hitler and the Axis powers. Once Italy joined the war, they immediately sent forces to invade Greece, the Balkans, and North Africa. The only problem was that the British already had a military presence in parts of these regions. The British would do whatever it took to defend the Suez Canal and protect their oil supply coming from the Persian Gulf. If they lost this vital resource, Britain would be in a real danger of falling to the Axis powers. A large Italian force of over 100,000 men entered North Africa and were greeted by an army of around 36,000 British soldiers. The odds were in Italy's favor, but due to a lack of adequate training and leadership, the British were able to push the Italian forces back. In fact, by the end of Italy's campaign in North Africa, the Allies had captured around 130,000 Italian soldiers. This was not only a huge defeat for Italy early on in the war, but completely embarrassing and demoralizing for the country. Things in North Africa were so bad that Hitler had to send his own forces into the region to help out Italy. With the loss of so many soldiers in such a short time, the Italian leadership outside of Mussolini and his inner circle began to question if they'd chosen the right side. This dissent among Italian leadership would later lead to the betrayal of Hitler and the Nazis. And the embarrassment was not just felt in the military, but in every Italian who supported Mussolini and his decision to join Hitler. Many citizens supported the war effort to make their nation more powerful and to gain more land and resources for the country. But that would not happen if the military couldn't get their act together. Although Mussolini might have made the trains run on time, other parts of Italy's manufacturing infrastructure was far behind the rest of the world. The factories had a hard time getting the materials they needed, and when they did, Allied forces would bomb their buildings and set the Italian war machine back even further. Basically, Italy slowly realized it was in over its head. They were outmatched by most of the other players in the war, and although Hitler and his country were a force to be reckoned with, Germany was not able to send men and resources that Italy needed to get themselves back into the war after several defeats. Hitler's forces were now fighting the war on multiple fronts, and if the Axis powers were going to win, they needed Italy to start pulling their weight. There were also clear signs of unrest within the general populace of Italy just before the decision to betray Hitler was made. In 1943, only months before Italy would turn on their ally, a strike in the factories of Milan and Turin began. All the workers wanted were evacuation allowances for their families. The Italian people were starving, and hundreds of thousands of citizens were fleeing the cities and battle-stricken areas for the countryside. It was clear that Italian morale was incredibly low, and that many of the working class now wanted to get out of the war. Not everyone in Italy supported joining the Nazi forces in the first place, but the vast majority supported their dictator even if they didn't agree with what Hitler was doing. However, all that changed when it became clear Italy would not end up being the powerful nation its leaders had hoped for as a result of its allying the country with Germany. The citizens were demoralized and disgruntled. The military was in shambles, and Mussolini himself seemed to care less and less about the outcome of the war. It was at this point that the leaders of Italy realized a change was needed. It was time to get rid of Mussolini and to join the winning side. The Italians were now on the cusp of betraying the Nazis, and there was just one more thing that needed to be done. By the middle of 1943, the Italians had been beaten on and off the battlefield. The once proud nation was slowly falling apart. The Allies had already invaded southern Italy and controlled Sicily, and it was becoming clear that Hitler and the Nazis were not going to win the war after all. So the Italian government decided to jump ship and try to salvage what they could. Practically everyone, from members of the government to the average citizen, had lost faith in Mussolini and his ideologies. An emergency meeting was held on July 25, 1943, where Benito Mussolini was voted out of office by his very own Grand Council. The moment that he left the building to meet with King Vittorio Emanuele, Mussolini was put under arrest. Surprisingly, Mussolini showed very little emotion and seemed to not care that he was being booted out of power. But there was still time to save Italy as a whole if the new leadership could figure out a way to betray Hitler and join the Allies without giving away too much of their own power. The Italian government made General Pietro Badoglio prime minister of the country. Badoglio had been Mussolini's chief of staff, but had very different ideas of which direction the country should take to regain some of its former power. Badoglio immediately began negotiations with General Eisenhower. He wanted to surrender to the Allies and help them win the war against Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. The deal was that Italy would surrender and allow Allied forces to move through the southern part of the country without any resistance. Then what remained of Italy's military would help the Allied forces push the Nazis north and out of their country. Hitler himself must have known there was trouble in Italy when Mussolini was deposed and arrested. The Nazi leader needed to move fast, but even he may have underestimated how quickly the Italians would betray him. In the wake of Italy's betrayal, Hitler did the only thing he could. He sent his own forces to invade the country. The Italian military was already so disorganized that Hitler had no problem securing strategic positions. He already had troops in the country that were helping his former ally defend off enemy forces. To make sure the government who had betrayed him would not gain more power, Hitler sent his forces straight to Rome to capture the capital of the country. Nazi forces succeeded in their mission and forced the new government, including General Badoglio, to flee. But at this point, most of Italy had already betrayed him, and its citizens were more than willing to help the Allies defeat the Nazis. Whether Hitler was still friendly with Mussolini or not, he felt the former fascist dictator had some use left in him. Hitler found the mountain prison in which Mussolini was being held captive and sent forces to rescue him. Hitler then reinstated Mussolini as the new ruler of the Nazi-occupied northern Italy and named the territory the Italian Social Republic. Mussolini was once again the leader of a fascist government in Italy, but his reign wouldn't last long. As the Nazi forces were fighting off the Allies, which now included Italian help, the Italians in the north captured and executed Mussolini. This would be the second time Italy betrayed Hitler in a matter of months. To be fair, it was members of the Italian partisan resistance force who had carried out the execution, but as 1943 progressed, Italy betrayed Hitler over and over again. And keeping in character, Hitler started doing some insanely crazy things in Italy to show his displeasure. In the regions the Nazis controlled, Hitler rolled out vicious policies that forced Italian citizens to support and work for the Nazi troops that occupied their homeland. It seemed as if Hitler did not take the betrayal of his former ally well, as what he did next was absolutely nuts and a breach of the Geneva Convention. Hitler ordered one of his scientists to release a biological weapon on the populace of Italy. A Nazi scientist named Erich Martini was put in charge of the biological warfare project. Martini was a friend of Heinrich Himmler and a devout Nazi Party member. At the time, Martini was one of Europe's leading epidemiologists, especially around the malaria virus. Hitler sent Martini to Italy, where his task was to breed malaria-carrying mosquitoes and release them on the Italian population. The thought was that the Allied forces made their way further north, they would encounter the mosquitoes, contract malaria, and this would decimate their armies. Hitler didn't really care what the disease would do to regular Italian citizens, as they had betrayed him, and he was not a forgiving man. During Mussolini's dictatorship, a drainage project on the Pontine Marshes was carried out to create more usable land for Italian houses and farms. Everything went according to plan, and the swampland was turned into fertile farmland. However, Hitler had his forces reverse engineer the Pontine Marshes and make the swamplands once again. This provided the perfect breeding ground for Martini's malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Martini released over 1 million Anopheles labranchiae mosquito larvae into the swampland. Then the Nazis added salt water, making it less habitable for plants and animals, but an environment that the mosquitoes could thrive in. This form of biological warfare had very little effect on the Allied forces, but was devastating to the local Italian population. Once again, Hitler's bloodthirsty insanity knew no bounds. Italy's betrayal of Hitler was complete when on October 13, 1943, General Badoglio moved on to the next phase of his agreement with Eisenhower. He provided troops and resources to help the Allies retake Rome. Surprisingly, as the war was coming to an end, Badoglio resigned his position of power. This took Italy away from the dictatorship government that had gotten them tied up with the Nazis in the first place, and set the grounds for an Italian future that would be slightly more peaceful. The Italian betrayal of Hitler is a tricky thing because of the underlying reasons for the country joining the Nazis in the first place. However, due to numerous military failures, the demoralization of the Italian people, and the turning of the tide of World War II, Italy decided to betray Germany. This helped the Allies defeat Hitler and the Nazis in the end. Polish coast, 1950. The small group huddled amongst the rocks, only 15 feet from the breaking waves. The night air was cool, but thankfully not truly cold yet, as it would soon turn come winter. That would make the rowing easier. Andrzej carefully scanned the beach, but the coast seemed clear. The war may have ended 2 years ago, but the young Polish resistance fighter was still fighting against the Nazi occupiers. It was a hopeless battle. Hitler's armies had conquered the whole of Europe and were now pacifying the occupied Russian territories. There was no hope of freedom, but if not for himself, then maybe for others. He and his fellow resistance members had changed tracks from removing the Nazis to helping others escape them, namely Jews, Roma, and other minorities who were being rounded up by the millions and sent straight to their deaths in extermination camps across the continent. Andrzej gave a low whistle. A moment later, there was a return whistle. That was the signal all was clear from the team that was watching for German patrols. He nodded reassuringly to the 4 women and 5 children with him, as well as his 2 partners in arms. They only helped children and women escape the Nazis' grip. It was the men's duty to stay and fight. Following his cue, the group stood and began moving in a running crouch to the shoreline. They crossed the distance quickly and began to dig at the sand dune. The dune was actually 2 small boats that had been covered in burlap. To anyone who wasn't intimately familiar with the area, however, it just looked like another one of the beach's sand dunes. Andrzej tossed the burlap aside, revealing the boats, but something wasn't right. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, making it hard to see, so he used his hands instead. As he felt along the side of the boat, his hands moved across the strange shadows on the bottom of the boat. Bullet holes. Andrzej's cry of alarm was drowned out by the sharp sound of German whistles, the type their patrolmen and some policemen used to alert each other. A dozen flashlights came to life from the direction of where the resistance overwatch was supposed to be. It was a trap. He could just barely see through the glare of the lights a figure he recognized as Philip. Philip had been the one to give the all-clear signal, and now he had a gun to his head. The Germans only took prisoners so they could torture them, and the civilians he was escorting, well, they were dead either way. With the war, Andre unslung his submachine gun and began to fire at the rushing flashlights. He screamed at the women and children to get behind the boats, but then more flashlights lit up from behind them. It was a well-executed trap. Bullets roared back at Andre and his group in an angry fury, finding many members of his group. The muzzle flashes gave him something to aim at, though, and Andre turned his hatred on those unseen shooters, quickly expending one magazine, then another. He began to reload a third when he was shaken out of rage by David's voice. 15 years his senior, he fought in the short war to resist the Nazi and Soviet invasion before joining the resistance. Andre held him in the highest of esteem. "Andre, go! It's too late! Swim! Go!" David was vigorously gesturing at the lights of the ship out in the open water. Andre was stunned. Go? Leave them behind? What about the women and children? But the figures where they had been huddling between the two boats all lay still. "I can't, David, I can't just go." "Go, you fool. We're all dead on this beach. Go and live. Find another way to fight." Andre's legs were lead. He felt like a coward. David punched him hard in the arm, practically pushing him toward the surf. "Go, you idiot." Andre went. He rushed to the breaking waves as David unleashed a hail of gunfire to keep the German heads down. Before Andre dove beneath the waves, though, he heard the distinct sound of David's Błyskawica submachine gun go abruptly silent. He felt the impact of the bullets in the water around him, accompanied by a high-pitched shriek as they went from faster than the speed of sound to a standstill in just a few feet. Andre dove until he hit the bottom, and then he furiously pumped his arms and legs as he fought the surf trying to push him back to the beach. In school, he'd been an excellent swimmer, and motivated by the gunfire of 24 furious Germans, he made it out to the surf line before surfacing for a desperate breath of air. As his head broke the water, he could hear the Germans still shooting, but they had no idea where he was amongst the tossing waves. Filling his lungs, he dove under and started kicking out to sea again. A few hundred feet offshore was an American destroyer accompanying a group of American merchant vessels. Ostensibly, the U.S. naval presence was to safeguard American shipping to Europe in waters it called potentially hazardous due to neutral shipping, despite the war being officially over for 2 years. In reality, it was a show of force by the U.S. After the fall of Britain, it was now the world's premier naval power, and it wanted Germany to remember that, should it get any ideas about crossing the Atlantic. Andre swam fast, and he could see the searchlights coming to life on the American destroyer. Crews scanned the water and the shore, both alerted to trouble by the German shooting. In little time, Andre was found and locked in the gaze of one of the big spotlights. The other 2 spotlights on the ship were aimed directly at the shore. The American sailors were blinding the Germans so they couldn't shoot in Andre's direction. The United States had remained neutral during the war despite the pleas of Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Agreements with the German Reich forbade it from loading political refugees from Reich territory onto its ships, but rescuing sailors in distress was part of international maritime law. Thus, U.S. ships routinely sailed near German-controlled coasts, meeting small boats full of refugees and helping them on board. The Reich launched protest after protest, but the U.S. considered these refugees to be sailors in distress and deferred German diplomats to international maritime treaties. A line with a flotation ring was thrown out at Andre, and he clung to it gratefully. He was nearly at the point of fatal exhaustion and couldn't pull himself up the rope to the deck. Instead, the sailors gestured and did their best in broken Polish to encourage him to slip the ring over his head and under his armpits. Working together, a team of sailors dragged Andre on board. He was immediately greeted with a warm blanket, and a few minutes later a hot cup of coffee. He was safe, on his way to America, but everyone else was dead. Manchester, English federally administered zone, pacified territories. Gerald impatiently waited his turn at the Reich's Cultural Affairs Office. In the last year, the Nazis had set to stabilize England and gotten on with the process of direct administration. It felt strange to him. Just a few years ago, this was the Kingdom of Great Britain, the most powerful empire in the world, with direct control over 25% of the world's economic activity. Now, it was just another piece of the Reich's territory, nominally independent, but in truth directly under the control of Berlin via proxy leaders. Perhaps most surprising is how most of the population simply went along with it. The Reichsmark had now almost fully replaced the pound as the German installed exchanges across the aisles. Sighing to himself, Gerald accepted that most people simply wanted to move on. Sure, there were still groups of rebels out there in the hills and forests, but the truth was Britain was beat through and through. The Americans refused to come to their aid this time, and even cut off their Lend-Lease program after the German protests. Britain had stood alone, cut off from its vital trade routes with overseas colonies by German U-boats, who choked the island nation off and starved it into submission. The RAF had fought bravely in the skies, but with no American oil supplies, the Luftwaffe eventually overwhelmed it. The entire countryside still bore the scars of German bombers and the subsequent fighting that raged after the invasion. Gerald's business had been one of the many destroyed in the fighting, and in exchange for government grants to get himself back on his feet, he was here at the Reich's Cultural Affairs Office along with dozens of his countrymen. It was illegal to operate or start a new business within the Reich without a license from a local administrator, and the process inevitably involved a trip to the Cultural Affairs Office. Soon, he heard, it would be mandatory for every citizen. But for now, the Reich's bureaucracy was overstretched with reconstruction. At last, it was his turn to enter one of the 5 interview offices. The man seated behind the desk was unmistakably German, not a British collaborator, but still greeted him with a polite smile. Gerald wished he was looking at that smile from down the iron sights of his Lee Enfield. "Welcome, Mr." The bureaucrat looked over Gerald's file briefly. "Gerald Adamson, I see you're here to complete your application for federal assistance." Gerald nodded. The bureaucrat's English was pretty good, with only the slightest hints of a German accent. He wondered if he'd been trained for his job back home or if he had been one of the thousands of spies and infiltrators who had sabotaged Britain from within during the war. "Excellent. We're eager to see your business restored and once more profitable." He didn't doubt the German was being honest here. The Reich liked efficiency and productivity. For all its evils, it was a very well-organized institution and pretty good about bringing order to the post-war chaos. "And I believe you brought your genealogy records, marriage license?" "My wife is dead, killed in the bombings." The German blanched for a second. Maybe he was human after all. "Ah, yeah, very unfortunate, Mr. Adamson. You have my condolences. I'm grateful that the unpleasantness is behind us now and we can turn to the task of rebuilding together." Rebuilding together, that was the Reich's favorite slogan, plastered all over the occupied territories it held. Every week, it seemed the Nazis' propaganda ministry churned out dozens of new posters, films, and slogans, but rebuilding together was a classic that never really went away. The bureaucrat had clearly been trained to use this phrase as often as possible. Yet, Gerald thought he detected a very real moment of sympathy when he'd offered his condolences. He took the man in for a moment. He was young, maybe young enough to have been in school during the fighting and recently graduated. After the brief silence, the bureaucrat continued. "Your current records will suffice, Mr. Adamson. A moment, please." The man went to work poring over the assembled paperwork Gerald had presented him. It was common business documents, tax records, insurance statements, but also documents personal to Gerald himself. Genealogy and family records, old wedding licenses, birth certificates. The Reich called it proof of culture, but everyone knew what it really meant. Just like everyone knew what happened to those individuals of unsuitable cultural background. Officially, the Germans were only deporting these people, but Gerald had been privy to intelligence reports during the war. He was pretty sure they hadn't shut down their extermination camps. Unofficially, he was pretty sure those camps were busier than ever. He ought to have been nervous. Who knew what the German Reich would consider unacceptable to their fanatical desire for pure bloodlines? But truthfully, he felt very little anymore. He'd faced death too many times on the battlefield only to end up surrendering to an enemy who was evil incarnate. The same enemy represented by this boyish bureaucrat in a smart suit, whom had shown real regret at the news of his wife's death. The more Gerald thought about it, the more he was sure the kid really was young enough to have spent the war in school. Shame, he thought to himself. Wasn't his fault, not really. But how many innocent British kids had been caught up in the crossfire of a war they hadn't started? "Mr. Adamson, all looks in order, and I believe we can approve." But the kid never got a chance to finish his sentence as Gerald whipped his service revolver up and right into his face. One trigger pull later, and Gerald's application for federal aid was over. Gerald sat down heavily on his chair as the officers around him erupted with panicked screaming. He looked at the big clock on the wall in front of him, wondering if the Germans' reputation for precision and timeliness had taken hold even here, in the occupied ruins of Manchester. Exactly 3 seconds later, as the clock ticked 2:35 precisely, the dynamite bundle in his attaché case exploded. Votkinsk, Southern Ural Special Administrative Zone. Absolutely not. There's no manpower. Karsten Stengel, administrator of the Southern Ural Special Administrative Zone, slammed his fist on the table to punctuate his point. The sudden gesture surprised the normally unflappable Schutzstaffel commander. Quickly recovering his composure, Standartenführer Grossmann narrowed his eyes at the man who is technically his civilian superior. "Need I remind you that orders to expend all efforts possible in the advancement of the Führer's cultural advancement programs come from the Führer directly?" This question was more of a statement, or better yet, a sharpened dagger held at Stengel's throat. But while the good colonel might have gotten his way back in Berlin with such threats and bravado, it wasn't worth a damn out here in the Reich's frontier. Facts were facts, and the fact of the current matter is that there was simply not enough manpower. "My dear Standartenführer, you're more than welcome to lend your men to assist in the pacification efforts. I'm sure the Wehrmacht would appreciate the help of such elite soldiers." The SS colonel's face went red with barely restrained rage. For a moment, Stengel thought he might unholster the pistol at his side. For his part, Stengel struggled mightily to hide the tiny smile that stubbornly crept into the corner of his mouth. Everyone in the Wehrmacht considered the SS mostly a joke, pretty boys with fancy uniforms. It had been the army that had broken the French and English, and it had been the army who, after crossing the Channel and subduing England, turned on the Soviet Union. While the fighting was at its fiercest, the SS had busied itself murdering POWs and civilians who couldn't put up a fight. The entire organization disgusted Stengel, and so did its cultural advancement programs. Many in the army felt the same way. If Stengel gave the orders for Wehrmacht soldiers to assist the SS in rounding up communists, Jews, and God knows who else they had a problem with, he was pretty certain things wouldn't go the way the Standartenführer Grossman hoped. The southern Urals were far from the stable occupied territories of Europe and rife with partisans. The loss of an entire SS detachment wouldn't be entirely unlikely. The Standartenführer stood stiff as a board. "Very well, Administrator Stengel. I will inform Berlin of the delays and your choice to not alleviate those delays." Stengel waved the SS man away and out of his office. Even if he could spare the manpower, which, with partisan activity rife throughout the Urals, he couldn't, he still wouldn't have done so. He knew where the SS prisoners went, and he wanted no part of it. Besides, other than putting him directly in one of the SS's camps, there was little more Berlin could do to punish him than make him an administrator of freezing territory in the former Soviet Union that practically swarmed with partisans. Damn communists didn't know they'd been beat. If only they'd reached Moscow sooner during the war, lamented Stengel. They might have captured Stalin. Instead, that bastard fled to the other side of the Urals, and the Reich, well, gave up wasn't the right term. Decided it wasn't economical to pursue into the worthless eastern stretches of Russia was more accurate. The Reich had all the important economic and industrial centers as well as the rich oil fields of southern Russia. Anything east of the Urals was frankly not worth the money or manpower to take from the surviving Soviet Union. With a sigh, Stengel turned back to reading the latest casualty and material loss reports from the never-ending peacekeeping operations against the communist partisans. The issue of the SS camps nagged at his conscience, though. They'd grown in number out here in the east over the last few years, and even more were being built to process the vast population of the occupied Russian territories. He grabbed another stack of reports, this time from his urban development supervisor. Chief amongst many of his concerns was the issue of unpopulated homes, which grew by the day. Entire population centers were becoming ghost towns. Wild animals were spreading into cities and bringing disease with them, an issue for the future German colonists, not to mention they'd be moving into cities falling apart around them from a lack of basic maintenance, a serious potential safety hazard and health hazard. His supervisor's recommendation was that vacated quarters simply be demolished. Future colonists would have to build from scratch. Berlin would be very unhappy about that. Northwest Saudi Arabia neutral zone, 32,000 feet. The roar of the B-36's engines was deafening, requiring the use of headsets for the crew to communicate. Captain Jonathan Frakes had to push up against his ear to hear his bombardier clearly. He'd already swapped his headset for a backup, but the issue persisted. Must be an issue with the actual connector then. He caught his co-pilot eyeing the horizon warily, and he couldn't blame him. They both served in the Pacific together during the war against Japan, and gotten into a habit of keeping a sharp eye out for enemy fighters. Despite receiving an absolute wallop from the US Navy, the Japanese still managed to put up a pretty stiff resistance on the home islands. Rather than invade, America had opted to bomb and starve the Japanese into submission by destroying their industrial centers and blockading all Japanese shipping. After 4 years, the Japanese were starving to death and had little to no industry to speak of, prompting them to the negotiation table. Their forces in Manchuria suffered a little better. The Chinese nationalists had easily won over the communists after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and United Nationalist China backed up the might of the U.S. Army and had pummeled Japanese forces cut off from resupply. Perhaps if the U.S. had split its forces between the Pacific and Europe, Japan might have stood a chance. But with a united American military in the Pacific, even Japan's Pearl Harbor surprise did little more than slow the U.S. retaliation by a few months. The big intercontinental bomber had been in flight for 16 hours already, taking off from the U.S. base in China, skirting the Indian border on its flight west, since India was now administered by the German Reich. It had no escort because no fighter aircraft had the range for it, and if push came to shove, the B-36 could climb to a maximum ceiling of 40,000 feet and avoid any German fighter currently operational. Its mission was top secret, and there was a long list of contingency plans to put into effect should the bomber crash and the crew and payload miraculously survive. In fact, the Air Force probably preferred that nothing salvageable survive a crash. His bombardier alerted him. There was now only a few minutes from the drop point. Somewhere out ahead and below him in the desert were German positions, 23,000 German troops threatening to cross into the neutral zone, set up by an agreement between Germany and the U.S. after the end of the war in Europe. Germany had driven a spear deep into former British holdings in the Middle East and then pushed deeper. Hitler's ambitions threatened to place the entirety of the world's greatest stockpile of oil in German hands. The U.S. had threatened war should it continue south and east. The truce had held, but now German troops were gathering at the edge of the neutral zone. Hitler was either testing the Americans or didn't believe they were serious about intervention. This B-36 was here to prove otherwise. Captain Frox began to climb altitude. No doubt the Germans had been warned. The U.S. wanted them to have cameras ready and waiting for the show to come. America wanted there to be no doubt amongst any of the Reich's leadership that a continued war in the Middle East would end in disaster for them. With U.S. troops so far from the region, it was difficult to present a credible deterrent. But that's what Captain Frox's mission was all about. The bomb bay doors opened with a shudder, causing the whole plane to shake as its aerodynamic qualities were compromised. In his headset, he heard the bombardier calling for him to hold course. Hold, 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 deploy, egress. There was the audible thunk of a payload being disengaged from the aircraft, and Frox didn't need his bombardier to tell him to begin egress. He had seen film footage of what came next and already had the plane in a steep banking turn. He'd been assured there was plenty of time to egress, but he wasn't taking any chances. The plane was already several miles from the drop point when it happened. A bright flash of light, bright enough to compete with the sun, and moments later a supersonic shockwave that rattled and shook the aircraft, but the B-36 powered through it unharmed. The eggheads had been right. Frox had banked steeply to the left to put distance between himself and the bomb, but flew roughly parallel so the explosion could be filmed by 3 of the gunners. With the bright flash dissipating, he ripped off the special eye protection they'd all been assigned and took in the scene with a naked eye. The explosion was as awe-inspiring as it was terrifying. He'd heard that the U.S. had these back toward the end of the war with the Japanese, but never used them. Now he could see why. Besides, with their island completely blockaded, the Japanese were no threat to anyone. Nobody deserved these bombs raining down on their heads, but that's just what the U.S. was threatening to do if Hitler didn't respect Middle East neutrality. Surely the Germans weren't too far behind in developing their own, though. Watching the mushroom cloud growing over the uninhabited desert just 30 miles in front of the German positions, Frox wondered if he'd fired the opening shot of a brand new war. The end of World War II is fast approaching. Going out of his mind with stress, Adolf Hitler marches up and down his bunker underneath Berlin. He's acutely aware that he's not getting out of this alive. Above ground, Russian bombs blast Berlin as Nazi child soldiers throw down their arms and cry for their mothers. Women scream as merciless Red Army soldiers pull them out of their houses. Hitler won't let himself be paraded through the streets to be beaten and spat at and hanged from a rope. He has a plan that will ensure that this does not happen. And as he contemplates his grim end to his life, the definitive failure of his wretched ambitions, he has one more thing on his mind: the loot. Insane amounts of money, gold, art, jewels, and furniture. It all has to be hidden. The Nazis have a fortune of unimaginable proportions. They don't want to give that up, so they'll hide it where no one will ever find it. This boundless treasure, taken in such endlessly harrowing circumstances, will be hunted for a long time to come. Today, we'll touch on this Nazi fortune and the many treasure hunters who have spent years trying to find it. But first, I want to tell you about the sponsor of today's video, Morning Brew. Nothing is worse than starting your day by endlessly scrolling through news and social media apps, hoping to find something relevant to you. And when you do find something that sounds interesting, the actual story is often dry, dense, and boring. Believe me, I had the same problem, and it was starting each and every day off on the wrong foot. And that's why I now begin each day with Morning Brew. Morning Brew is the free daily newsletter that's really the absolute best way to start your day. It'll get you up to speed on everything you need to know in minutes, with business, finance, and tech stories that actually respect your time and get you the info you want quick. Want to find out the real reason why a random company is suddenly the latest meme stock? Or learn what types of content TikTok finally decided to ban from their platform? Or maybe you want to impress your friends with in-depth knowledge about how Lego became a multimedia powerhouse. It's only a 5-minute read. But to get it, you'll have to sign up for Morning Brew yourself. It's completely free and takes less than 15 seconds, so do yourself a favor and become smarter in just 5 minutes every day by signing up for Morning Brew at morningbrewdaily.com/infographics, or click the link in the description. When the Nazis invaded a nation, the first thing they would do is usually head to the central bank. They wanted the gold, they wanted hard cash, they wanted everything of value. The invaded country knew this was going to happen, of course, so they'd usually try to get as much gold as possible out of the country. Sometimes it went to New York Federal Reserve in Manhattan before ending up in Fort Knox. But that didn't always happen. On March 12, 1938, the German Wehrmacht marched into Vienna, Austria. Soon a businessman and friend of Hitler, Wilhelm Kepler, arrived at the Austrian Central Bank. At his side, were armed men. They ordered the bank to hand over about 100 tons of gold. They knew that Austria had already sent 5.7 tons of gold to England, where they thought it would be safe. Kepler told them to bring it all back. He said it's now the property of the Nazi Party. This was just one case, one country. Wherever the Nazis landed, they looted with abandon. We can't say for sure how much gold Germany stole during the war, but some say it was at least $20 billion worth in today's money. Some sources have it in the hundreds of billions. On top of what they took from banks was the gold, houses, and other belongings they stole from the Jewish people during the Holocaust. There were also the artworks. Lots and lots of very valuable artwork. Wherever the Nazis went, they stole the art. Hitler hated a lot of modern art. He called it degenerate. That might have had something to do with the fact that he himself was a failed artist. But for someone with such an unartistic outlook on life, he wasn't actually that bad, or at least in terms of the basics. You can see what was going on in his mind when you look at this painting of Jesus and the Virgin Mary. His blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus doesn't really look like someone from the Middle East who spent a long time under a hot sun. He looks more like a baby version of one of the Hanson brothers. Hitler wasn't someone who could appreciate an art form such as Cubism or Expressionism, but the Nazis, and especially the Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, stole a lot of valuable modern art despite what Hitler thought about it. The Nazis also took ritual silver pieces from all the synagogues they plundered. This amounted to a lot of silver. Many of the items were eventually recovered by the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, aka the Monuments Men. But a hell of a lot of the Nazi plunder was not so easy to find. This included a lot, and we mean a lot, of hard cash, on top of all the gold and silver and hundreds of thousands of valuable cultural items. If we take into account everything the Nazis looted over Western Europe, parts of the Soviet Union, and as far away as Africa, you could say the years-long robbery was the biggest robbery ever. Just take into consideration something like this. In 1943, when the Nazis were in Tunisia, North Africa, they took a load of gold from the Jewish folks on the island of Djerba. As usual, the Nazis intended to send the gold back to Germany, but it may have gone down with the ship on the way. We say may because it's not certain what happened to that gold. As you'll soon see, separating the myth of Nazi gold with the reality of Nazi gold isn't always easy. How much treasure is still out there is hotly debated even today. But we think by now you have a good idea about how much wealth the Nazis had. This is why when the Russians entered Germany at the war's end and the UK, US, and France were soon to be there, one of Adolf Hitler's chief concerns was all that Nazi loot. During the war, much of it was kept in the Reichsbank, the central bank of the German Reich in Berlin. Hitler knew that once the enemy got to Berlin, one of the first things they would do is head to the bank. It was a chief concern of his that he'd lose the gold. In February 1945, the bank was almost destroyed when close to 1,000 B-17 flying fortresses started dropping bombs on Berlin. With these planes, the US dropped around 1.5 million tons of explosives. The Soviets' Red Air Force, as well as the British RAF Bomber Command and the French Air Force, also did their fair share of dropping bombs on Berlin. Berlin had taken a beating for years, but that February attack by the Americans destroyed many major buildings and left many people homeless or worse, dead. There were hundreds of people working in the bank when it was hit. There may not have been any deaths, only because the employees were already in hiding in underground bunkers, and the blasts only destroyed the upper levels of the building. Still, Hitler now knew that it was time to move much of what was in the bank's vaults out of there. For years, those vaults had been getting fat with gold bullion, not to mention thousands and thousands of gold teeth and pieces of gold jewelry that had been taken from Jewish prisoners after they'd killed them in the gas chambers. Many of these pieces were deposited in the bank under a fake name, that of Max Heilinger. Under this name, the Nazis stored not just gold items but also banknotes, arts, and valuable furniture. The gold would later be melted and other things eventually fenced to dealers. We should also say that the Nazis stole from thousands of Poles, Russians, and other Europeans, Romani and Sinti, as well as Jehovah's Witnesses and homosexuals. The Nazis thought this little scheme would make them rich and leave no obvious tracks, but after the bombing of the bank, it was looking like Hitler and the Nazis might lose it all. This is why Hitler ordered some of his commanders to start emptying the vaults. Part of the removal consisted of about 100 tons of gold bullion, worth millions back then, so a fortune in today's money. The removal also included 3,682 bags of German marks, 80 bags of foreign money, 63 bags of silver, some platinum bars, lots of jewelry, artwork, and hundreds of bags of valuables that had been stolen by the Nazi elites. All this was sent to a salt mine in the village of Merkers, about 200 miles from Berlin. This was only part of the Nazi stash, but it was enough to help Hitler breathe a sigh of relief. Not long after Hitler started thinking the loot was safe, Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army was crossing the Rhine. On April 4th, the 3rd Battalion of the 358th Infantry Regiment walked into Merkers unaware of what was stored down in the salt mine. 2 days later, Lieutenant Colonel William A. Russell of the 19th Infantry Division's G5 was outside the mine asking questions. He'd become suspicious after talking to a few people, so he told the German mine bosses he wanted to have a look down the shafts. When a few of his men went down there, they could not believe their eyes. It felt like a dream. In front of them was a good chunk of Germany's gold reserves, millions in paper money of various currencies, as well as art and other valuables kept in trunks and piled up on crates. Many of the obscenely valuable treasure chests were packed into a space of 23 meters and 46 meters down into the ground. Dwight D. Eisenhower inspected the loot for himself and later wrote, "Crammed into suitcases and trunks and other containers was a great amount of gold, silver, plate, and ornament, obviously looted from private dwellings throughout Europe. It's a rough estimate, but the value of everything found would be about $8 billion today. But there was lots more." On April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, he was breathing a little heavier again. He was now in the midst of a nervous breakdown. He could hear artillery shells in the distance. He was having nightmares about being strung up and humiliated by mobs of Soviet soldiers. He also heard that those damned Americans had found his gold. Outside in the streets, German families feared what their fates would be. Children stood on street corners with guns in their hands, their helmets too big for their heads. Elsewhere, certain Nazi leaders were trying to get out of Germany and take their loot with them. Hitler knew he wasn't going anywhere. He'd die in the bunker and make sure that all the documents down there no longer existed when that bunker was found. On April 28th, Hitler and his secretary Eva Braun got married. It wasn't a very jolly affair, to say the least. Hitler didn't look well at all. His skin was ashen white, his fingers constantly trembled. Every time he heard a bomb explode in the distance, a look of anguish crossed his face. When he was informed about how the dead Benito Mussolini had been strung up on meat hooks in Milan's Piazzale Loreto, he looked as though he was going to throw up. He wasn't so bereft that he couldn't have someone take down his final will and testament. In it, he said, "The responsibility of the outbreak of this war cannot rest on me." The blame, he said, rested on international Jewry and its assistants. He also bequeathed his art collection to the town of Linz, and anything else of value, he said, should go to the Nazi Party. Surely, at this point, he might have been thinking about all that loot. One thing's for sure, the Red Army was thinking about it. They pretty much had a field day when they entered Berlin. They committed obscene atrocities against the people, especially the women. They walked into the finest houses, shot anyone who stood in their way, and relieved the families of all their valuables. It would be a massive understatement to say the Soviet Union and its people suffered during the war. So it's not too surprising that an unofficial order was given to soldiers which said, "Take what you wanted, but things of high value should be taken back to the Soviet Union," under what they called a trophy commission. They cleared out museums, libraries, people's private collections, and things they found in the National Archives. It was a free-for-all. Individual soldiers looted houses when they'd done what they felt they had to do with the occupants, but the big stuff was supposed to go back to the Communist Party. They took all artwork that had been created by some of the greats. This included works by Monet, Cézanne, El Greco, Goya, Bruegel, and Van Gogh, Rembrandt, Raphael, and Leonardo. They found incredibly valuable religious artifacts as well as important medieval manuscripts and even some gold treasures of Troy. They'd only admitted to taking the latter in 1994. As you'll see, just how much the Soviets sequestered is up for debate. It's hard to say what it was all worth, but reports state that there were millions of objects that could be worth many billions in today's money. In the minds of the Soviets, they deserved everything they'd taken in light of their suffering during the war. Nonetheless, they were aware that they should have had much more. Where was the rest of the gold? The Nazis said they had more gold than you'd find in the legendary El Dorado. The Soviets only recovered about $3 million in gold from the Reichsbank, but subsequent interrogations revealed that there had been more like $17 million of gold in the bank. It was only then that they discovered that a heist had taken place at the bank in April. This was the work of future war criminal SS Colonel Josef Spaziel, under the orders of his seniors in the SS. Spaziel would later testify against some of his commanders during the Nuremberg trials. That's why he went on to live a normal life after the war. He might have even opened a chain of supermarkets, but that's not certain. Still, it seems he did okay after the war. That could partly be because he was put in charge of taking care of a lot of the Nazi gold, as well as various stolen currencies. One thing we should make clear here is that all the gold and cash in the vaults of the Reichsbank was the bank's money, the public's money. No Nazi had the right to waltz in there and empty the vaults. So when Spaziel and his men turned up at the bank on April 22nd, they were armed with machine guns. They ordered the staff to load gold, jewelry, and cash into trucks waiting outside. There's about $146 million in foreign currency alone, although not much gold was taken as it was so heavy. They drove the trucks out of Berlin and later flew to Austria, but what they did with all that money is still a bit of a mystery. This is why some people have said for a long time that the vast majority of Nazi cash and gold has never been accounted for. In the book The Reichsbank Robbery, the author claims that some SS officers made deals with officers in the US military and together they funneled a lot of the money out of Germany. We can't say if this is true, but it makes more sense when you know that many Nazi war criminals were sneaked out of Germany in so-called rat lines, paid for and managed by US intelligence services. After all, the Soviet Union was now the enemy. The US required Nazi informants and expertise. For sure, a lot of Nazi money was laundered through Swiss banks, and there's no doubt some high-ranking Nazis kept a bit of it, but that doesn't account for all of it. There have been plenty of rumors about the whereabouts of the gold and cash, such as some of it ending up on the Auckland Islands, but these sound more like tall stories than facts. Some stories, though, make you think there's a fortune buried somewhere on this earth. Let's now begin part 2 of this story, an investigation into the missing gold and mountains of money. Let's call this section The Hunt for the Nazi Gold. A few years ago, a Polish treasure hunter named Tomasz Jurek told a US journalist there are so many tunnels, who knows what else is there? It's the tip of an underground city. He was referring to a mountainous area of Lower Silesia in southwestern Poland. Before and during the war, this was a part of Germany, and as the war came to an end, many of the Germans living there got out as fast as their feet could carry them. Often that meant walking right into the Red Army's guns. More often than not, they were shot down like vermin. They had no time to think about packing up their valuables. But what's interesting is that when the area was repopulated by Poles, many of them made some rather startling discoveries. The Germans had left surprises for them, treasure, lots and lots of treasure. As the war was coming to an end and the Russians were marching toward Berlin, many wealthy Germans thought Lower Silesia was a safe place to hide their valuables. High-ranking Nazis headed there to hide their loot. But as we said, regular people also just left all their riches behind, sometimes hidden in the ground. A man who was the chief of police during the war, a German military officer named Herbert Kloss, was later interrogated by the Poles. Under duress from the interrogators, he admitted that he'd been asked to store as much silver, gold, and other precious things as possible. He hid the items inside chests, after which the chests were sealed and buried. He told the interrogators the gold was stored at police headquarters. The chests were made of iron and hermetically closed with rubber seals. Also, the chests were unmarked, so nobody would know what was inside. Only many of these chests were buried when he wasn't there. He'd apparently fallen off his horse and was hospitalized for a while, so he didn't know where the chests were. Some people did, and one day they expected to go back and reclaim them. For decades, people have been looking for this bounty of gold. Treasure hunters were and are well aware of this great big stash that the Americans had found down in the mine. They know what you have found out today, namely that somewhere there is a fortune to be found. These people have looked in earnest. They haven't been compelled to dig for a lifetime by some ancient myth. There is missing money, missing gold, missing art. It's just a matter of time before someone finds it. How it was distributed between the Nazi leaders at the end of the war remains a mystery. Many Nazi leaders died, many were executed, many more went on to live mysterious lives on the run. The Americans helped some while they lived under alias in South America and other countries. To this day, there are treasure hunters who believe that much of that gold is underground in a series of giant tunnels. They say some of it is stored on a train that's gotten the name the Nazi Gold Train. It all sounds like something out of the movie franchise Indiana Jones, but people take this seriously. Some people believe that on that buried train, there are 300 tons of gold, a cornucopia of precious jewels, expensive weapons, and also quite a few priceless artistic masterpieces. Historians say this train might not have even existed, but by God have people looked for it over the years. As the New Yorker wrote in 2016, treasure hunters believe there is a labyrinthian complex that may hold many Nazi treasures. That amounts to something like an underground city. In that article, the journalist wrote that he was met by a Polish geophysicist from the Polish Academy of Sciences and was taken to a German-dug tunnel that was 16 feet high and 18 feet wide, and big enough for a Greyhound bus to drive down. The journalist asked what exactly were the Nazis building here. The scientist replied, "That's the mystery." Were they building a subterranean city that would store all their valuables and money? Were they intending to build superweapons down there, or were the tunnels just a place to hide for Nazi leaders? At the end of the war, the Germans closed most of those giant tunnels off. Although most of them were a work in progress, some of them were almost done. 11% of them were reinforced with concrete and others had just been started. Millions of work hours had been put into building the tunnels. They were incredibly hard to engineer and harder to excavate, but Hitler was adamant that they had to be done. Why? No one really knows. It was only when the war ended that the Poles would be walking around near the mountains and discover a railway track that seemed to end for no good reason. Sometimes they'd find a hole that led to a shaft. Sometimes they'd be strolling through the forest and discover they'd just walked over a ventilation shaft. The Nazis had been very busy bees indeed. We should point out that the labor involved in the underground city construction had been done by many thousands of enslaved people whose lives often ended with a shovel in their hand. Some of them were worked to death and others died from disease and malnutrition. It's thought that about 5,000 prisoners died working in the tunnels. Documents show that some were sent back to Auschwitz concentration camp. One document states that 14 tunnel workers were executed after trying to escape. As much as treasure hunters have dug and have spent their entire lives exploring such tunnels and looking for new ones, no one has yet come across a major stash of treasure. Some valuable items have been found, but not the billions they believe are missing. The story gets even more interesting when you hear what a treasure hunter named Krzysztof Szpakowski recently said. He'd been looking for the hidden treasure since he was old enough to legally buy alcohol. He said years back when he first started looking, he interviewed some old German folks who lived in a small village not far from one of the tunnels. They all told him the same thing. Over a couple days in 1945, German soldiers marched into the village and told everyone to close their curtains and stay inside. They warned that anyone who looked out the window would be shot on the spot. The next thing they knew was the sound of a truck convoy rattling through the village. Szpakowski said the trucks were heading for one complex of tunnels called the Waldasch Complex. He believed that this had been built at first as a hiding place for only the highest-ranking Nazis, but they later decided that the complex would become a depository for precious goods, perhaps arms, but more likely loot. What better place to hide it? Something similar is written in a book called The Mysteries of the Valim Undergrounds. The author writes that over a few days at the end of the war, long convoys of trucks drove through the town, and not one of them came back. He says the trucks were hidden in a tunnel, after which the Germans blew up the entrance and planted vegetation around it. Even with modern technology, finding a hole in the ground that's hidden somewhere over a large area is not easy at all. Even when a new tunnel is found, the treasure hunters usually end up in a vast space full of endless opportunities to explore. One dead end could just mean the start of another series of tunnels. As the journalist for The New Yorker said, like a lottery ticket, each tunnel sparks a new dream, and every treasure hunter seems to have his own wish list: gold, jewels, artwork, and an underground train terminal, or a supercomputer prototype. Then again, did the Red Army clean up after the war was over? Did the Soviets take a lot more trophies than the rest of the world knew about? Or did US intelligence make some deals and run off with the swag? Was there any swag in the first place? Some people think not. Or at least they say what loot is there has been greatly exaggerated. Still, in 2018, something happened that showed people anything could be down in those tunnels. That's because while looking for the gold train in Lower Silesia, Polish treasure hunters said they had found 4 tons of gold, 10 feet below a disused 18th century palace, a place reportedly used by the Nazis as a brothel. This happened after decades of treasure hunters had been looking high and low for the train and treasure chests. The group that found it, the Silesian Bridge Foundation, said the gold was hidden inside a buried canister. Still, when reports surfaced, it seemed the canister had yet to be checked, as there was a concern it was booby-trapped. We're still not sure what happened here, as the media didn't update the report. The hunters used an SS diary they had been given to derive clues about the hidden treasure, and they later scanned the ground using radar technology. One of the lead hunters told the press, "Our information says that this particular deposit was hidden by an SS officer called von Stein. The SS planned to use it to re-establish agriculture in Ukraine to feed the new Reich." He said the same diary points to a lot more hidden gold, as well as art, jewelry, and religious artifacts, all hidden at sites throughout Lower Silesia. Part of one of the diary entries read, "The remaining 48 heavy Reichsbank chests and all the family chests I hereby entrust to you. Only you know where they're located. May God help you and help me fulfill my assignment." It also mentions 47 works of art, with names such as Monet, Cézanne, and Rembrandt popping up on the pages. The Silesian Bridge Foundation says the diary was written by an SS officer who used the possibly fake name Michaelis. He talks about 11 different sites where the treasure is buried, including the mega amount of gold bullion taken from the Reichsbank. The diary itself had for years been kept at a Masonic lodge, one that in the past was frequented by wealthy members of the Third Reich. It seems the newer members of the lodge had wanted it off their hands and so recently handed it over to the foundation. Even if you don't believe the tons of gold and cash are somewhere under the ground, many of the 5 million European artworks that the Nazis had stole have not been recovered. It's thought that 63,000 works of art and valuable cultural items stolen from Polish Jews alone are still either hidden or secretly owned by people who don't want to return them. Still, again, we have to say that people might be getting carried away with their hunt for Nazi gold. For example, it was believed for a long time that 4 tons of the stuff was aboard the SS Minden when it was sunk off the coast of Iceland in 1939. That story goes that the German captain sank the ship himself rather than let it fall into the hands of the approaching British. A subsequent theory said that it contained all the gold, and perhaps more valuable items. But when the wreck was finally explored in 2018, no gold or other precious things could be found. So is the gold still hidden? Or like many of the valuable works of art, did some of it find its way into someone's basement? Was the money spent years ago? Or is there a train somewhere beneath Poland that carries a fortune, buried under many tons of soil and enslaved people's blood? We don't know, but if we lived in Lower Silesia, we'd be out exploring next weekend. Adolf Hitler, one of the worst human beings to ever walk the earth. The very existence of a man like Hitler raises a lot of questions about the nature of good and evil. One of the biggest ones being, are monsters like Hitler born evil, or has something in their life made them that way? That's why we're going back to where it all started and taking a look at Hitler before he became the Führer, before he even joined the Nazi Party in the first place. Did something happen to this man in his youth that made him the monster he turned out to be? Let's take a look and find out. It probably doesn't come as a surprise that Hitler's father was a terrible guy. Alois Hitler Sr. was born Alois Schicklgruber in 1837 in the small Austrian town of Strons. He was an illegitimate child of a 42-year-old unmarried Catholic peasant known as Maria Schicklgruber, which carried a fair bit of social stigma at the time. He wasn't even given a proper surname on his baptismal certificate. The priest just wrote illegitimate instead. This was likely a major source of insecurity for young Alois. When Alois was just 5, his mother married a local miller by the name of Johann Georg Heidler. It's strongly believed that Johann could have actually been Alois's biological father, but nobody can ever really know for certain. Some have speculated that a Jewish man named Leopold Frankenberger was actually Alois's real biological father, but there isn't any hard evidence for this whatsoever. It just came into popular belief because the idea of Hitler, history's most famous anti-Semite, having a Jewish grandfather seemed darkly ironic, but this assumption doesn't really line up with the facts. 4 years after the marriage, Maria passed away, and Alois was sent to live with his new uncle Johann Nippelmunck Heidler, with whom he trained to become a cobbler. But that wasn't the path that Alois ended up taking in his life. Instead, he became a civil servant and joined the semi-military profession of being a customs official. This led him to bouncing around Austria for a number of years, and in 1877 he decided to right the biggest perceived wrong of his life and legitimize himself. With permission from his church, he asked to change his surname from Schicklgruber to that of his legal father, Johann Georg Heidler. For reasons lost to time, the official who filled in Alois's papers wrote his name as Alois Hitler rather than Alois Heidler. It's crazy to think that if Alois had never gotten his name changed, we might have been looking back in fear at the dread of Adolf Schicklgruber. Doesn't quite have the same scary ring to it, does it? So who is Hitler's mother? She was actually the third wife of Alois. His first wife was the wealthy Anna Glassel-Horer, but much like his future son, Alois was a bad guy and would have affairs frequently, often cheating on her with girls as young as 19 when he was 43. He next married one of his mistresses, Franziska Fanny Matzelberger, after Anna died, and had 2 children with her. However, he would soon leave her too for his housekeeper, young Clara Posel. But there was just one problem. Depending on the truth of Alois's parentage, Clara might have also been his first cousin, or even his niece. Yes, that's right, Hitler could have been the product of cousin incest, and things would only get stranger from there. As Alois and Clara started having children together, they had 6 in total, Hitler included, but the grand majority of them died in their infancy. Gustav, Otto, and Ida died of diphtheria the year before Hitler was born, and another one of his brothers, Edmund, would die of measles in 1900. The only surviving children of Alois and Clara were Adolf and his younger sister Paula. Adolf was born on April 20th, 1889 in the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn, close to the German border. He lived with his mother and father, his biological siblings Paula and Edmund, and his 2 half-siblings from his father's second marriage, Angela and Alois Jr. While he was close with his mother, conflict with his father and his inability to adapt to school gave young Adolf a troubled childhood. Alois Hitler Sr. was a profoundly cold and cruel man to his immediate family. He was controlling, distant, and would beat his wife and children at the drop of a hat. Some even recounted that he'd make a show of beating the family dog until it wet itself on the carpet. Adolf was a confident and free-spirited young man, so he received the worst of his father's physical abuse in their frequent fights. They also moved around a lot during Hitler's youth, as Alois Sr. retired from his job as a customs official and decided to move to the Austrian town of Hafeld to farm bees. The move made things even worse for Adolf and Alois Sr.'s relationship. Adolf was enrolled in a strict state-funded elementary school and found himself at odds with the establishment's rules rules and regulations. This led to further violence from Alois, who wanted his son to take a similar career path to himself. While Clara tried to defend her son from his father's wrath, she often ended up on the receiving end instead. It was a truly toxic home life. When the bee business failed, the Hitlers continued to move around over the next few years. Hitler, now 8 years old, started to take an interest in art and performance. He began painting watercolors and even taking singing lessons from his school choir. However, his life would take a major hit when his brother Edmund died in 1900. This tragedy shook young Adolf, changing him from a confident, outgoing child to a withdrawn oddball who regularly got into fights with teachers and, of course, his father. By this point, the seeds of hatred and nationalism were already growing within young Adolf. A frightening but important thing to remember is that Hitler's views, while obviously scary and extreme to us in the modern day, had its roots in extremely common sentiments for pre-World War I Austria and Germany. Hitler and his friends, despite being Austrian, were loyal to the German cause, hated growing ethnic diversity in Austria, and would even greet each other with Heil. It's likely that many of the adults in his life expressed similarly hateful views, including his father and school teachers, making it seem extremely normal to believe such things to a growing Hitler. His school performance only got worse as the years went on. Alois wanted Adolf to work at the customs office and even took him on a tour in one of his early teen years. Hitler felt that this was the moment that the differences between him and his father became truly irreconcilable. He knew by now that he wanted to attend a classical school and develop his painting skills to become a professional artist, but his father instead forced him to attend a technical school. Hitler would later recount in Mein Kampf that he did badly in this school on purpose, hoping that when his father saw how terrible his performance was, he'd allow him to pursue his dream. This was the first of many grave miscalculations in Hitler's life. But in the end, one event did allow Hitler to drop out of school: the sudden and unexpected death of Alois Sr. in 1903. Likely due to a pleural effusion, he was out drinking at a local inn when he suddenly collapsed and died shortly after. When the 14-year-old Hitler saw his father's corpse, he supposedly began to weep uncontrollably. He and his father may have constantly been at each other's throats, but losing another family member was just too much. His school performance deteriorated further until his mother eventually pulled him out of school entirely. After a year to put himself back together under the doting care of his mother, Hitler returned to school with improved grades and performance. He was never a particularly good student, but he was able to pass his exit exams with 2 different attempts. He left school with no intentions to continue pursuing a technical career. With his controlling father dead and his mother being far more supportive of her son following his dreams, he set off to cosmopolitan Vienna to develop his artistic skills and hopefully join the Academy of Fine Arts. But by now, we all know how that turned out for the aspiring artist. Hitler was rejected twice by the Academy, finding his artistic abilities subpar. Because Hitler specialized in drawing landscapes and buildings, they suggested instead that he try his luck at the local Academy of Architecture. However, this is where Hitler's earlier decisions came back to bite him, because his poor school performance left him without the necessary academic qualifications to enter the architecture college. Naturally, this left Hitler feeling pretty sour about his time in Vienna. But contrary to popular belief, his rejection in art school wasn't nearly as important in his development as the ideas and beliefs he was beginning to learn from his new locale. Hitler had always been a nationalist, but in Vienna, it's believed that he first started developing his hardcore anti-Semitism. He read local magazines that blamed Jewish people for all the problems that Austria and Germany were experiencing. Some who knew Hitler claimed his anti-Semitism predated his time in Vienna, but it seemed as though this time in Vienna finally gave him the political and philosophical framework for his irrational hatred of the Jewish people. But amongst all this, one final tragedy would strike the now 18-year-old Adolf. His mother Clara, the only surviving member of his family that he was truly close with, had been diagnosed with terminal breast cancer at the age of 47. She was diagnosed and treated by the Hitler family doctor, Dr. Edward Bloch. He later recounted that Clara took the news with dignity, as a deeply religious woman who believed that everything happened was part of God's plan. Adolf was devastated. Dr. Bloch described the closeness of their relationship in later interviews, stating, "While Hitler was not a mother's boy in the usual sense, I never witnessed a closer attachment. Their love had been mutual. Clara Hitler adored her son. She allowed him his own way whenever possible. For example, she admired his watercolor paintings and drawings and supported his artistic ambitions in opposition to his father, at what cost to herself, one may guess." When she finally died from the disease, Hitler was, according to Bloch, the saddest man he'd ever seen. He was utterly broken, his last tether to humanity and decency cut. It was clear that Dr. Bloch's good treatment of his mother meant a great deal to Hitler, as he was one of the few Austrian Jews that Hitler allowed to move from Austria to the United States in 1940, as his genocidal plans were beginning to pick up steam. Later, being interviewed, Dr. Bloch described Clara as a kind and decent woman, and said that she would roll in her grave if she ever knew what a monster her beloved son became in the end. So, we return to the big question. Did Hitler's childhood turn him into a monster? Did Clara and Alois raise him to be a person capable of committing genocide? Was his childhood so tragic that it made him evil? Well, no. Hitler's beliefs were the product of popular and toxic philosophies that were rife during his time: nationalism, authoritarianism, anti-Semitism. It might be more comforting to believe that Hitler was some kind of fluke, a supervillain born out of incest and abused into being evil by a controlling father. But even if Adolf Hitler had never joined the Nazi Party, a man like him would have, given how common it was to think like he did back then. Hitler never could have done what he did alone. It took millions agreeing with him, and millions more simply doing nothing or being killed while trying to rebel. Bad childhoods don't cause genocides. A society growing to hate its most vulnerable people does. We all know how the Second World War ended in Europe, with Allied forces surrounding Berlin and Hitler killing himself in his bunker before the entirety of the German army surrendered, stopping the spread of fascism throughout Europe and the rest of the world. But throughout much of the war, this end was anything but certain, and there was a real fear that Germany and the Axis powers couldn't be stopped. Luckily, Hitler was an ineffectual military leader, and much of Germany's failures on the battlefield can be traced to his poor decisions. But what would have happened if Germans had removed him early in World War II? The date is May 15, 1940, and World War II has erupted with unprecedented violence across the heart of Europe. For 8 months, British and French troops had largely held their defensive positions across France and Belgium during a period known as the Phony War. Despite the declaration of war by France and Britain on Germany, neither side had yet launched any major offensives, and only minor skirmishes had taken place between the two sides. Then, suddenly, with shocking ferocity, the German army ambushed the Allied forces by cutting through the thick Ardennes forest. Considered far too difficult terrain for large columns of tanks and vehicles, the move is a logistical miracle and a strategic coup for the Wehrmacht, which quickly flanks and splits the British and French forces in two. Hooking to the north, the Germans have caught the majority of Britain's expeditionary forces, over 300,000 men, between themselves and the North Sea. Disaster looms for Britain. A defeat of their own BEF will cripple Britain's military and see the single greatest loss of personnel by any power in centuries. Across the Channel, an armada of boats assembles, the British desperate to save their stranded forces along with 80,000 French forces. Naval vessels along with fishing vessels and even pleasure craft are recruited into the effort, creating an armada of over 800 ships to rescue the doomed soldiers. On the German side, German General Gerd von Rundstedt orders a halt to the offensive against the retreating British and French forces. His sub-commanders are in complete shock. They are days away from crushing the bulk of Britain's army and inflicting a mortal blow on the French forces. A halt here, just miles from Dunkirk, will allow the British and their allies to retreat to the safety of Britain. But Rundstedt is concerned that the marshy ground around Dunkirk will prove too difficult for his panzers, and despite objections from nearly all his sub-commanders, the order is given for the panzer assault to halt. The order is relayed to German High Command and directly to the desk of the Führer himself. Hitler agrees with Rundstedt's assessment and approves a halt to the offensive operation, against the protest of nearly all of his generals. An official approval of Rundstedt's halt order is dispatched via secretary to a wire operator, who prepares to transmit the order to the units out in the field. Suddenly, though, the operator, a young German officer, is escorted away from his workstation by German military police, and in 3 days' time he will find himself amongst the troops preparing for the assault into France's south. Confused by his swift and sudden change of posting, in his place is another young German officer, this one fiercely loyal to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command. The officer dispatches a modified version of Hitler's orders to Rundstedt, ordering him to continue with the assault. A day later, Hitler is furious to discover that his order has been botched, and the blame is laid on the new young wire officer. He is punished for his mistake by being stripped of rank and sent to the front, though secretly Field Marshal Keitel has already prepared to restore the officer's rank once he arrives at his new unit and is clear of Hitler's wrath. Hitler's increasing micromanaging of the war is grating on Keitel and the other senior officers' nerves, and with alarm, they're beginning to realize that the Führer considers himself a strategic genius who insists on running the war his own way. Yet, Hitler's own battlefield experience never went past trench warfare in World War I. He never even held his own command. In Dunkirk, the Luftwaffe savages the British, and despite the brief lull in the fighting, they are not able to construct key defensive positions that will buy time for the retreat. The panzers savage the British forces long before the rescue armada is able to sail away more than a few thousand to safety. The British Expeditionary Force and their French allies are crushed, with tens of thousands of casualties and over 200,000 taken prisoner. Historians consider the Dunkirk defeat the greatest military catastrophe in history. Back at the German High Command, Field Marshal Keitel Keitel holds a secret meeting with the other senior military commanders. They've successfully defeated the British forces at Dunkirk, but Hitler's order to halt the panzer divisions would have seen this major victory turned into a disastrously missed opportunity. The generals grow increasingly worried about the Führer's capacity to lead Germany's armed forces. Weeks later, France falls, with German troops triumphantly marching through the streets of Paris. The French government in exile in Britain joins its ally in calling for U.S. help. In America, Congress agrees to accelerate the production of war material to be shipped to Britain, and President Roosevelt dispatches William J. Donovan, a trusted confidant and World War I veteran, to Britain in order to assess Britain's ability to resist the Nazis. President Roosevelt and the American people on a whole are wary of joining another world war, and despite their close ties to Britain, there is little appetite for joining a war on the losing side and sacrificing hundreds of thousands of American lives. Donovan arrives in Britain, and despite the British Foreign Ministry's best efforts to paint the situation in a positive light, it's clear to the experienced soldier that the loss of the entire British Expeditionary Force has crippled Britain's military. Within 2 days of arrival, he sends a secret telegram to President Roosevelt, informing him that it's his personal assessment that the best Britain can do in its war against Germany is defend its home isles and use its mighty fleet to keep Germany landlocked on the mainland. Roosevelt agrees with the assessment and, in private sessions with Congress, informs U.S. lawmakers that he has no interest in declaring war against Germany. Material support to Britain will continue, but America is not willing to sacrifice its soldiers in a European war. German intelligence learns that America is not considering joining the war on the Allies' side and sends its own delegations to Washington. They implore America to cease its shipments of materials to Britain, which the U.S. refuses, but in a bid to maintain relations, they do agree to limit the total tonnage of goods shipped to their former ally. In exchange, Germany promises not to harass American shipping vessels. The joint American-German accord frees up naval vessels from the Atlantic, which quickly transition to the Pacific through the Panama Canal. While war has been raging in Europe, Japan has continued its aggressive campaign in China, and the United States is wary of Japan's ambitions in the Pacific. Japan knows that if it's to successfully grow its empire, it must quickly neutralize China and the Americans both. It's too small of a nation to wage a long-term war of attrition against the superior manufacturing might of the United States. Plans for a surprise attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor are considered, and then quickly scrapped when the fleet is reinforced by major elements from the Atlantic. America pushes Japan to cease its hostilities against the Chinese, but stops just short of declaring war. For their part, the Japanese largely ignore America's demands and continue to push Chinese forces south and west out of Manchuria. Having placed America on war footing, President Roosevelt dispatches large amounts of troops, planes, and ships to the Philippines in order to secure American interests. On a diplomatic visit, the Japanese ambassador assures President Roosevelt that Japan's ambitions are limited to China. Yet Roosevelt demands that Japan pull its forces out of China and cease its hostilities. In Europe, Germany has consolidated its hold on France and Belgium and launches an assault into Norway in order to seize vital iron mines and some other wartime industries in the country. Sweden remains neutral, and in secret negotiations, Finland agrees to support German offensives against the Soviet Union. With Britain's military crippled by the defeat at Dunkirk and America refusing to join the European war, Germany knows its position in France is secure. This frees up many divisions of infantry and panzers who all prepare to join Germany's Eastern Command for a massive assault against the Soviet Union. Prior to the start of the invasion, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, German ambassadors meet with President Roosevelt and present an offer by Hitler himself, a non-aggression pact. This pact is mutually beneficial to both sides. It will ensure that Germany not need fear a British-American invasion of France and will allow the U.S. to concentrate on a single-front war against Japan to remove them from China. The deal is signed and publicly declared 3 days later, sinking British hopes that America will join the war on their side. With the declaration of the non-aggression pact between the US and Germany, Japan immediately launches a surprise attack against American forces in the Philippines, while the Carrier Strike Group launches a massive air raid against Pearl Harbor. With the buildup of American forces in the Pacific, though, the assault against the Philippines is easily repelled, and the surprise attack against Pearl Harbor is a disaster. Japanese aircraft manage to cripple and destroy several American battleships and destroyers, but the bulk of the fleet is already out on maneuvers and not in the harbor when the attack arrives. American submarines locate the Japanese carriers waiting for their air crews to return and savage the Carrier Strike Force, sinking 3 of the 6 carriers. Dozens of returning Japanese aircraft can't find room to land on the surviving carriers and crash land into the sea. The US officially declares war on Japan and immediately launches offensives against its Pacific holdings, while transferring hundreds of thousands of troops to mainland China. At the same time, Germany declares war on the Soviet Union, and the blistering German assault catches the Red Army completely by surprise. Finnish forces, eager to retake their territory lost in the Winter War of 1939, join in the assault and quickly reclaim all territory they were forced to cede to the Soviets. With France secured against invasion via the joint German-US non-aggression pact, the bulk of Germany's forces are free to join in the assault against the Soviet Union. In the initial stages of the offensive, Hitler once more meddles with the strategies and plans of the German military high command. His commands to begin the mass extermination of Europe's Jews has driven a deep rift between himself and Field Marshal Keitel, who has rallied most of the high command to his side. In a stunning move, the high command launches a coup and removes Hitler from power. The SS, under the command of Heinrich Himmler, launches an assault on army headquarters in Berlin. But Wehrmacht units, long wary of the SS, rush to the defense of the high command. In a brief battle lasting just a few hours, the SS contingent is defeated, and military police arrest Heinrich Himmler. Martial law is declared across Germany, and the Wehrmacht begins a campaign of police action against the fanatical SS loyalists remaining, leading to many firefights between the German army and surviving SS units. The state-sanctioned genocide of the Jewish and other marginalized people are stopped, and Hitler and Himmler are both placed on trial for incompetence and crimes against humanity, with their extermination camps built by the SS serving as key evidence against them both. In days, they are executed, and Germany begins to reform itself as a republic. By 1945, the German army has successfully conquered the eastern territories of Russia, and content to hold the richer areas of the Soviet Union, have forced a ceasefire on the crumbling Soviet Union. Germany now controls Europe from as far west as France to as far east as Kazakhstan. In the Pacific, the United States at last pushes Japan out of China, and with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the war in the Pacific comes to an end. The year is now 2019, and the world is very different from the one we know today. The German Republic continues to control the majority of mainland Europe. An alliance of vassal states that includes Britain and Spain forms the bulk of a German-led alliance known as the European Union. In the Pacific, the Philippines, Australia, Japan, and China form the backbone of the Pacific Treaty Organization, led by the United States of America. The removal of Hitler in the early stages of World War II has allowed a German republic to flourish following their conquest of Europe. And with the collapse of communism and the remnants of the Soviet Union, the world never experienced a Cold War. International treaties limit the number of nuclear weapons amongst the 2 global superpowers, Germany and the United States, to only 700 active warheads. Occupied Germany, 1945. 2 Americans sit in a Jeep watching a quiet country road. A young teenager riding a bicycle rides toward them, but the boy seems like no threat and is largely ignored. As he passes the Jeep, the boy suddenly comes to a stop and from underneath his jacket brandishes a submachine gun. 1 empty magazine later, both American military police are dead. The boy, no older than 15, uses a thick grease pencil to write a symbol on the hood of the Jeep, a straight vertical line intersected by a horizontal line with a hook at the end. This is the symbol of the werewolves, Nazi Germany's last-ditch effort to repel the invading Allies. It had started weeks ago, with news that French, American, and British forces had broken through the last defenses on the homeland's border and were now streaming into Germany. In the east, the situation was equally grim. The glorious victories against the communists had been reversed in a year, and now it was the Soviets who were invading the fatherland. In sheer desperation, Hitler and his senior advisors scrambled to find a way to motivate a largely demoralized and exhausted German army. They once more turned to the occult, as they have so many times throughout the war. This time, though, they seek to inspire their soldiers to victory with the legend of the werewolf. As the Nazis would tell it, the werewolf was not a bloodthirsty monster out to devour hapless villagers and travelers on a full moon. The werewolf was actually a seriously flawed and misunderstood but well-meaning individual who used their supernatural powers to defend the forests of Germany. They were a savage last line of defense for the German fatherland, noble in their ferocity and righteous in their fury against any interlopers who dared threaten their woods. Now, the Nazi Party tried to turn real men into werewolves, who would themselves become the last line of defense for Germany. 2 werewolf movements are started simultaneously. The first is an official paramilitary force drawn from surviving veterans of the Long War, many of them scarred and bloody. but veterans through and through. They would engage in sabotage, espionage, assassinations, ambushes, anything they could do to slow the Allied war machine and grind it to a halt. The unit of Nazi werewolves would still be under the command of Hitler and his military leadership, directed with precision and extreme violence at high-value military targets. In the late summer and early autumn of 1944, Heinrich Himmler initiated Operation Werewolf and began to gather an elite troop of soldiers. Various werewolf units would operate behind enemy lines, in exactly the same style as the highly successful British and American commandos, and harass the enemy's rear areas. They would destroy supply caches, assassinate high-level military leadership, and spread demoralizing disinformation throughout the Allied ranks. SS Obergruppenführer Hans Adolf Preutzmann was placed in charge of what would become several German werewolf units. For his part, Preutzmann had studied the tactics employed by Soviet guerrilla forces and was assigned to teach these same tactics to German soldiers. Unlike the Soviet guerrillas, though, German werewolves would still wear military uniforms and operate within the bounds of German high command. Thus, if captured behind enemy lines, the expectation was that they would still be treated like enemy combatants and not guerrillas, which could be punished with execution if caught. However, this first attempt at creating German werewolves was doomed by Preutzmann and his leadership team. Captured German officers after the war related that Preutzmann was a weak, inefficient, and uninspiring commander. Further, he was, quote, vain, idle, and boastful, a damning judgment of a man in charge of creating an elite group of commando fighters. The whole plan was so mismanaged that even Walter Schellenberg, Heinrich Himmler's head of foreign intelligence, told Himmler that the entire operation was criminal and stupid. The second unit of German werewolves, however, would not be an official military unit, but rather an unofficial guerrilla movement made up of civilian volunteers. A few military advisors would see to their training and equipping, but the movement would largely rely on word of mouth to spread across the countryside, and everyone from children to women were invited to join in on it. The goal was simple. German civilians were to rise up with the ferocity of the legendary monster itself and rip, rend, and tear the invading Allied armies. They would strike at targets of opportunity, carrying out acts of sabotage, murder, and espionage, but largely undirected by military leadership. Instead, each civilian werewolf was to act of their own initiative and make the Allies pay dearly for every inch of land they violated. The first werewolf volunteers began to form into unofficial units late 1944, as it became clear that the Germans were going to lose the war. While the military would do what it could, Nazi leadership began to prepare for an Allied invasion of the fatherland. It was their hope that a force of civilian partisan fighters could be raised to meet the Allied threat as it crossed into the fatherland, but it would not be a standing army. Rather, the civilian guerrilla resistance would be decentralized in nature, thus giving the Allies no clear command structure to target and eliminate. Resistance cells would act largely of their own accord, carrying out opportunistic acts of sabotage and assassination. The goal was not to defeat the Allies militarily, but rather to bleed and weaken them with a protracted fight and slowly weaken their resolve. Then, given enough time and harassment from German werewolves, the Allies could be brought to the negotiation table and work out a peace settlement as favorable to Germany as possible. Even with the noose tightening around Germany, Hitler still held on to the hope that Britain and America could be coerced to sign a peace deal with Germany and then actually join to fight against the Soviets. On paper, it wasn't a very crazy idea at all. The Western Allies had very little in common with the Soviets, and the Soviet Union's sponsoring of workers' strikes and attempted communist uprisings across Europe was something that put the Western Allies and the Soviet Union at great odds. Ideologically speaking, Britain and the US had more in common with Nazi Germany than with the Soviets. But Hitler misunderstood how little appetite for continued war the Western Allies had. And while they would do what it took to crush Nazi Germany and ensure the Nazi Party never rose to power again, nobody wanted to continue the war with the Soviet Union if such a thing could be averted. Further, after years of bitter fighting in a previous war against Germany 20 years ago, the British and American public would never stomach allying with the Germans to fight a campaign that would largely benefit Germany in the end. Hitler had an even bigger problem than trying to convince the Western Allies to join him in a fight against the Soviets. The werewolf movement was collapsing before it even began. With the Nazi bureaucracy in chaos as defeat inched ever forward, contradicting orders and general confusion crippled the attempt to organize the partisan movement. A much bigger problem, though, was the fact that by now German factories had been bombed nearly to oblivion, and German industry was struggling to keep up with the needs of a regular army. Outfitting a massive national partisan movement was nearly impossible at this point. By 1945, though, it was clear that the German army would be pushed back over the Rhine, and the Allied invasion of the homeland was inevitable. This time, Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels took the effort to raise an army of German werewolves who would meet the incoming Allies with teeth and claws. chaos. With Goebbels firmly in charge of the movement, much of the confusion and chaos of the first attempt was eliminated. The propaganda minister quickly set to work on a national campaign that would play on Germans' fears of the vengeful Allies as well as fierce patriotism. On March 23, 1945, as the Allied war machine pressed into Germany, Goebbels gave what would become known as the werewolf speech, urging German citizens to rise up against the invaders and fight to the death for the fatherland if necessary. A week and a half later, a werewolf propaganda station, Radio Werewolf, began to broadcast from outside Berlin. Each broadcast would begin with the sound of a wolf howling, and then play a song with lyrics like "My werewolf teeth bite the enemy," and then he's done, and then he's gone. German citizens were commanded to resist the enemy in all possible ways, and Goebbels' propaganda even attempted to convince the Germans that the Allies had plans to enslave the German people at war's end. Goebbels' orders to the German people were simple. Every Bolshevik, every Englishman, every American on our soil must be a target for our movement. Any German, whatever his profession or class, who puts himself at the service of the enemy and collaborates with him will feel the effect of our avenging hand. A single motto remains for us: conquer or die. As the war grew ever more desperate, attempts to form proper military werewolf units and grow a partisan movement began to blur. Some official units were created from the SS and Hitler Youth Reserves, and these received direct support and training. They were even instructed to lay low as the Allies pushed into Germany and then rise up from behind their ranks as a cohesive fighting unit. These front companies of secret soldiers, however, were all discovered and dismantled by the Allies within months. The supply problem plagued the German werewolf effort, though, and civilian partisan fighters were left to fend for themselves, often attempting to take on Allied military personnel with old hunting rifles and improvised explosives. Originally, large caches of equipment and explosives were to be buried in secret places throughout the country, so at the war's end, the werewolves could rise up and carry out a guerrilla campaign against the occupiers. However, not only were supplies critically low for the German war machine in 1945, but the highly disorganized nature of the werewolf movement meant that what supplies could be hidden away were only known to a small number of individuals. Unable to get the location of these caches out to the werewolf movement as a whole, most of these caches would end up simply discovered by the Allies, especially the Soviets, as the bulk of these caches were built close to the Polish border. Goebbels knew that previous efforts to create a true commando and paramilitary force had failed spectacularly, and thus, in early 1945, he brought in the legendary Nazi commando Otto Skorzeny to train the new werewolf movement. Skorzeny was a highly decorated German soldier and responsible for some of the most legendary deeds of daring of the entire war, including the rescue of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from an impenetrable mountaintop fortress surrounded by enemy forces. His tactics and missions are still studied by Special Forces soldiers around the world today. Skorzeny, however, quickly discovered that the number of werewolf units had been greatly exaggerated, and that the recruits he was meant to train largely consisted of fresh-faced teenagers who were until recently Hitler Youth. Compounding the manpower problem was the abysmal supply situation, and inevitably Skorzeny concluded that the werewolf movement was doomed to failure. Instead, he restructured what official werewolf units were into a sort of underground railroad that would help sneak thousands of Nazi officers out of the country toward the end of the war. In the end, few German citizens answered the call to become Nazi werewolves. The civilian population was simply exhausted from years of war and 2 years of heavy bombing of their cities and infrastructure. Much to their surprise, they found out that many of the Western Allied forces treated them relatively well, much unlike the enslavement and slaughter that Goebbels had tried to convince them would take place. While the threat of the German werewolf would be overblown in the post-war years, a few actual attacks were carried out by remaining fanatics. Of these attacks, fewer yet were successful. By and large, the German people were ready for peace and had little stomach left for continued bloodshed. In fact, after the German surrender, there was no reported American combat casualties, and the German people proved ready to work with their occupiers to rebuild their homes and nation. When people think of Hitler's headquarters, they usually think of the Eagle's Nest, the mountaintop headquarters that's become a popular tourist site as people come to see the gathering place of some of history's biggest monsters. The one person who is not such a big fan? Hitler. The Nazi dictator didn't like heights and only visited it 14 times. His choice in headquarters was lower, more hidden, more fortified. Hidden in the woods over 5 miles from the nearest town of Rostoberg, it doesn't even lie in modern-day Germany. Once Prussia, now Poland, those who make the pilgrimage could almost miss it. Today, it lies covered in moss and ringed by trees, a relic of a time gone by. But those who get close will find an impressive sight. A massive stone fortress, it has the distinctive name the Wolf's Lair. Why? Because Hitler, never shy to proclaim his own superiority, had taken on Wolf as a nickname and liked to litter it through his various headquarters in Europe. And he was unsatisfied with his current choice of hideaways, especially with the war raging in 1940. And in 1940, he ordered his party machine to start construction on the new headquarters far from the chaos of the war. And it would be massive. The organization taught Hitler's civilian and military engineering organization was quickly put to work, and so were the large collection of forced laborers they commanded. The plans were drawn up and the total complex would be around 2.5 square miles in size. With 3 security zones, it would be connected to civilization by a nearby airfield and rail line. But only those in the know would be aware, because if the Wolf Slayer had one thing going for it, it was camouflage. The forest provided its own form of camouflage, with thick trees, bushes, and grass making it hard to see what was beyond the horizon. But that was nothing compared to what would be added around the Wolf Slayer. Artificial trees would be erected around the complex and on top of the buildings, making it look like part of the forest from the air. Buildings would be connected with dense netting, so approaching soldiers wouldn't be able to see. Much of the forest had been carved out for the massive fortress, and that was nothing compared to what was going on inside. The Wolf Slayer was known for its 3 security zones, each built in a concentric circle. Each one had a unique purpose. The first security zone was at the heart of the compound. All it took was one look at the facility to know no one was getting in if they weren't supposed to be there. Surrounded by steel fences, the zone was guarded by high-ranking SS officers and managed by some of Hitler's closest allies. Inside, camouflaged bunkers made from concrete reinforced with steel would hold Hitler and his inner circle for military conferences and when they were hiding from Allied forces. Hitler's specific quarters were built on the northern side, so they would never even be hit by revealing sunlight. The other zones served 2 purposes. The second zone surrounded Hitler's inner circle, and it was a place of refuge for high-ranking allies of Hitler, including Albert Speer and the master of the organization taught Fritz Todt. While it served as a living quarters, the fortified area was also filled with military barracks, and all those who were within knew they were potentially the barrier between the Allies and Hitler and might be called upon to defend it. But if the place was designed properly, the enemy would never reach it. Security Zone 3 encircled the other 2, and it had one purpose: repel all invaders. Heavily fortified, it was surrounded by landmines and dotted with watchtowers and checkpoints. And overseeing the whole thing was the Führerbegleitbrigade, a powerful armored unit of the Wehrmacht that was often assigned to personally escort Hitler. The exterior of the complex was also guarded by a local army unit, and they were equipped with tanks and anti-aircraft guns. If anyone got too close to the Wolf Slayer, they would likely find themselves overwhelmed, even if they had no clue what they'd gotten too close to. And they would have good reason for the security. By the time the Wolf Slayer was completed in June 1941, it was easier to list which countries Hitler hadn't invaded. The Nazi leader had conquered much of Western Europe, including France, and was at war with Great Britain. While Germany and Russia had been allies, that was about to end. Only one day after the layer was completed, Hitler began invading the massive Soviet Union. He was the most wanted man in the world, and at the same time as he launched a new front in the war, he moved into his new massive bunker. It would become his de facto capital on the Eastern Front, and it would be far more than just a hideout, because Hitler spared no expense. The Wolf Slayer wasn't just a bunker, it became Hitler's primary living quarters during the height of the war. The dictator had requested amenities that would be more at home in a high-end hotel. He had access to a barber shop because that distinctive mustache didn't shape itself every morning. He would dine on the finest cuisine at an on-site restaurant. He even had a personal casino for himself and his inner circle. I guess it wasn't enough to gamble on the lives of millions of soldiers in Russia. But if you thought he enjoyed it, maybe think twice. As the war front grew and the United States got involved in the war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Hitler became increasingly unstable, erratic, and paranoid. The dictator became obsessed with the idea that he was being targeted, and even suspected many of his closest inner circle. As the war raged on, the staff and regulars at the Wolf Slayer grew. While many bunkers only housed a skeleton crew, the Wolf Slayer needed guards, engineers, and staff to attend to Hitler's every wish. At its height, the facilities housed a massive 2,000 people, all of whom were subject to Hitler's fast-changing whims. He had a routine, and he did not want it disturbed. During most times, Hitler was predictable. He would take his daily walk with his dog, then look at the mail that had been funneled in by plane or train. He would meet with his military advisors and then go for a run before lunch. He would sit in the same seat every day between Alfred Jodl and Otto Dietrich before adjourning to deal with non-military matters. Coffee would follow, after which there would be more military briefings. But there was one area of the day where Hitler was most paranoid. Hitler was convinced someone was plotting to kill him. And he was probably right, but they might not have been in the bunker. But that didn't stop him from becoming obsessed with the idea that his food was being poisoned. He was served elaborate vegetarian meals in the on-site restaurant, but before he would take a bite, he insisted that the staffers taste it before he did. Whether there was a risk or not, Hitler was so convinced that he was being targeted that the staff became paranoid as well, many weeping with relief when they didn't die after their job as tasters. There were brief moments of peace in this headquarters of evil. When the day's business would end, Hitler's bunker almost became a party. After dinner, everyone would retire to the on-site movie theater where films were shown to the entire crowd. Afterward, Hitler and his inner circle would retreat to his private room. They would listen to music, usually his favorite Wagner or Beethoven music, but above all, Hitler loved to hear himself talk and would frequently give elaborate monologues to those closest to him. But danger was lurking, and the Nazi leader was looking in the wrong direction. The Wolf's Lair was supposed to be safe, and it was, from outside enemies. But Hitler had made many enemies in his inner circle. His paranoia, erratic behavior, and genocidal obsession with purging Germany of those he deemed undesirable had made many in the military see him as an unfit leader. By 1944, the German army was the underdog in the war, and military officers were discussing if the only way to save the German war effort was to eliminate its leader. A group of officers decided to assassinate Hitler and install a new military-centric government that would turn the tide of the war. But to get to Hitler, they'd have to strike at his inner sanctum. Hitler had been well protected from the outside, but he was vulnerable to those he let in. One of those was Staff Officer Klaus von Stauffenberg, a decorated war hero who had access to the daily conference meeting. He would bring a briefcase bomb into the meeting, place it near Hitler, and get clear in time. It would be the closest anyone got to assassinating Hitler, but close was no cigar. From the moment of the day the assassination began, things started to go wrong. It all built to an explosive end. Von Stauffenberg's plan was thrown off when the meeting was moved to a different room, as the Wolf's Lair bunker was under construction. The new room was unfamiliar, and von Stauffenberg ran into more trouble when the meeting was called earlier than expected. The bomb was placed, but it was moved slightly before it went off, and when it blew, Hitler was only lightly wounded. Although 4 people in the meeting died as a result of their injuries, Hitler survived, but his inner sanctum had been pierced. It was the beginning of the end. The assassination attempt and the associated Operation Valkyrie had failed, and collaborators were quickly arrested and many were executed. But the Wolf's Lair was about to face a much bigger problem. Hitler had learned the hard way what Napoleon learned a century earlier. Invading Russia rarely goes well. The German invasion had run into rough waters, and now the Russians were turning the tide. The Red Army was on the march, and by October 1944 they reached the borders of East Prussia. They soon came across the Wolf's Lair, but Hitler had abandoned it, heading toward his final bunker in the last days of the war. But the Russians wanted to make an example of this complex. The order was given to bring it down, and it would be no easy task. The fortified bunkers were not meant to be destroyed from the outside, but that didn't deter the Russians. They brought in a whopping 18,000 pounds of TNT and detonated it in January 1945. The whole area shook, the smoke cleared, and much of the building was still standing. Hitler had led his country to ruin, but taking down his favorite bunker was proving to be less possible than toppling his regime. And that wasn't the only reason it was difficult to take down. The Red Army soon found that clearing the many landmines surrounding the installation would be challenging. In total, 54,000 landmines would be removed from the area surrounding the complex, a testament to just how fortified it was, and how paranoid Hitler was that anyone would penetrate it. And even today, Hitler's massive complex still stands. The area of the Wolf's Lair was initially taken over by the post-war government of Poland and fell into disrepair. But when the communist government fell in the 90s, the new government saw potential for something else, a tourist site. The ruins draw almost 300,000 visitors a year and is surrounded by hotels and restaurants. There have even been proposals to rebuild it to make it safer and more attractive to tourists. But that's raised some questions about what the appropriate way to handle the legacy of a monster is. Should the site be razed to avoid it becoming a gathering site for Hitler's remaining fans? Today, the Wolf's Lair still stands as a testament to the massive war machine Hitler built, and how ultimately it was still doomed, just like his regime. A young Adolf Hitler sits outside a Vienna cafe painting a picture of the building across the street. He is covered in dirt from the ground he slept on the previous night. He's completely broke and homeless. Hatred fills his heart as he receives rejection after rejection from art schools and patrons. No one wants him or his paintings, it seems. In a few years, everything will change. The struggling artist that is Adolf Hitler will transform into a monster, and his art is partially to blame. Before uncovering the secret history of Adolf Hitler's art, Let's make something very clear. Adolf Hitler was a terrible person, a genocidal maniac, and the driving force behind the most bloody and brutal war in the 20th century. He has no redeeming qualities, and there is no excuse to justify the atrocities he committed in World War II. We will be exploring his early life and art career not to humanize the man, but to understand his shortcomings and examine his art career. Hitler was born out of wedlock on April 20, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, Austria, to his mother Maria Anna Schicklgruber. He was baptized Catholic, although he would denounce all organized religions and only worship the state once he started his reign of terror. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official, which is the career he wanted for his son. However, Hitler had other plans, and they all hinged on the death of his father. In 1898, Hitler's family moved to Linz, Austria. It was there that Adolf Hitler was educated, or at least took classes, as he never finished school. By some accounts, Adolf Hitler was a nightmare child who was constantly disruptive and wouldn't follow directions. He wasn't very intelligent, or at least he didn't care enough to try very hard in school. This would eventually lead to him pursuing alternate paths throughout his life. Hitler and his father rarely saw eye to eye when discussing his future. All Hitler wanted to do was paint and be an artist. His father was much more practical and forced his son to go to secondary school so he could eventually work for Habsburg civil service. Hitler dragged his feet and did everything he could to just barely pass his classes in the hopes that his father would realize he wasn't suited for civil service. But then Hitler caught a break. In 1903, Alois Hitler died, and his son was now free to quit school and pursue his dream of becoming an artist. This would be a turning point in young Adolf's life, one that would end up with him developing his anti-Semitism ideology and eventually becoming the nightmare leader of the Nazi Party. In 1907, at the age of 18, Adolf Hitler grabbed his paintbrushes and headed to Vienna, which was then the epicenter for fine arts in Austria. It was here that Hitler firmly believed he would develop his skills and become one of the greatest artists the world had ever known. However, like with most things in his life, Hitler held delusions of grandeur. He never doubted he would be a successful artist, but when he reached Vienna, he would receive a swift slap in the face from reality. Before he left Linz, Hitler's mother had become very sick. She had breast cancer that was causing her immense pain and keeping her in bed for days at a time. She rarely left the house, and it sapped almost all of her energy when she did. Rather than staying and taking care of his dying mother, Hitler packed his bags and left her to fend for herself. He even had the audacity to ask her for money to start his art career in Vienna. Even a monster such as Hitler still had a loving mother. She wanted her son to pursue his dream, so she gave him as much money as possible to help him rent an apartment, buy supplies, and apply to art school in Vienna. She likely knew she didn't have much time left, but making her son happy was more important than her own health, it seems. On the other hand, Hitler was much more selfish and didn't give leaving his sickly mother a second thought. Instead, once he got to Vienna and realized how expensive city life was, he asked his mother and other family members for even more money. Hitler had rented an apartment with a childhood friend named August Kubizek. Much to Hitler's dismay, Kubizek was almost immediately accepted into one of Vienna's music conservatories, where he began studying to achieve his dream of becoming a conductor. Unfortunately for Adolf, he had very little success when it came to achieving his goal of becoming a famous artist. The year he moved to Vienna, he started the application for the Academy of Fine Arts. It was a rigorous process that came in two stages. The first was providing a portfolio with past works in it. The second consisted of 2 3-hour sessions of painting scenes that were not disclosed to the applicants until the day of the entrance exam. With around 100 other applicants, Hitler made it past the first round of screening and was asked to come to the school for the second part of the admissions process. We can imagine that Hitler was somewhat ecstatic to be so close to reaching his goal of becoming an artist. However, in his autobiography Mein Kampf, he talks about the process as if he knew he'd get in. The fact that Hitler had not really succeeded at anything thus far in his life did not seem to deter him. But this is in line with the future Führer's delusional personality. Growing up, he thought there was no way he wouldn't become a world-renowned artist. Yet the admissions council did not see it that way. They were about to give Hitler the news that would change his life and the fate of Europe forever. It's interesting to think about what the world would have looked like in the coming years if the Academy of Fine Arts had made a different decision following Adolf Hitler's completion of the second phase of his admissions process. When Hitler sat for the painting test portion of the admissions exam, he and everyone else in the room was told that they would have to paint either an iconic scene from history or something biblical. This would be Hitler's downfall. As a young artist, he found painting landscapes and architecture satisfying, so his human characters were always in the background or had little importance in the piece. This was not what the admissions council was looking for. They critiqued Hitler's work by saying it contained too few heads and faces. And although the committee noted that Hitler's drawings of architecture showed promise, he would never make it in the fine arts due to the fact that he showed a lack of emotions or empathy in the human figures in his paintings. Think about that for a moment. Hitler could not draw humans well or even show compassion for his own creations on the canvas. Young Adolf Hitler saw beauty in the rigid structures of architecture, but could care less for the emotional aspects of human life. It was as if he couldn't be bothered to paint or even think about others' feelings, even if they were characters that came out of his own mind. In hindsight, the way he painted people in his works of art as an afterthought and devoid of meaning in the picture's context aligned pretty closely with how he would treat humans during World War II. At this point in his life, Hitler was starting to develop hatred for certain groups of people, and a main factor for this was the city he was living in. Vienna might have been a center for arts and music in the region, but something much more sinister was going on behind the scenes, something that Adolf Hitler would eventually seek out and embrace after being rejected from art school. There was one member of the admissions council who was sympathetic to Hitler's cause after he was rejected. This professor suggested that since the architectural features were well drawn in Hitler's paintings, he should apply to the School of Architecture. There was only one problem with this suggestion. In order to get into the School of Architecture, Hitler would need a secondary school degree. Since he decided to drop out without finishing his education, Hitler would have to go back to school, complete the degree, then apply to the School of Architecture, which seemed like too much work for the aspiring artist. He ended up completely rejecting the professor's recommendation. Hitler was confident there had been a mistake and he would still be an artist. He applied to the School of Fine Arts a second time and didn't even make it past the first round of screenings. It was reiterated by the admissions council that Adolf Hitler's paintings were utterly devoid of rhythm, color, feeling, or spiritual imagination. As you can imagine, Hitler did not take the second rejection from the admissions council very well either. He didn't tell his friends or family about the rejection. Instead, he carried on living a life of a broke artist in Vienna. Even as his mother slowly died in Linz, Hitler hid the fact that he had spent all the money that she had lent him and was denied entrance into the academy, which was the main reason why he had left her in the first place. Maria Anna Schicklgruber passed away in December of 1907, just before her son received his second rejection letter from the admissions council. Hitler didn't really mention how the death of his mother impacted him in his autobiography. In fact, it seems the only thing it changed was that he now needed another source of money. Again, like in his paintings, Hitler seemed to care very little for people in the real world, even his own mother. As Adolf Hitler grappled with the reality that he would never be accepted into the art school of his choice, he started to form delusions of conspiracies against him. He thought perhaps the admissions board was rigged, or maybe even Jews sat on the council itself. Before coming to Vienna, Hitler had come across anti-Semitic ideas in Linz, but there would be a couple of key players from this part of the country who would influence him to eventually become a genocidal maniac. At this point, Adolf Hitler was demoralized. He had no purpose in life. He was completely broke, and there seemed to be no hope of ever becoming a painter. However, Hitler had another opportunity to turn his life around. He'd been given the chance to work under graphic artist and stage designer Alfred Roller. Roller was a set painter and designer for the Vienna Court Opera's productions of Wagner. This would have been an incredible opportunity for a young artist, but like many things in his life, Hitler made a bad decision. Hitler was given a letter of introduction that would allow him to meet with Alfred Roller at his home. The meeting could have launched his art career to new heights, but as he approached the door, Hitler turned away without knocking. He would try 2 more times to muster the courage to knock on Alfred Roller's door, but would never succeed. It's not clear why Hitler did not seize the opportunity. Some scholars think he was just too afraid to face more rejection, while others believe that Hitler's ego was so big he refused to work in the shadow of another artist. Either way, Hitler's ambitions were falling apart. If he was going to make it as an artist, he would need to start selling his own paintings. Hitler never made ends meet as an artist in Vienna. The only reason he was able to live in an apartment his first year in the city was because his mother and aunt lent him a good, sizable sum of money. But as soon as that dried up, Hitler was on the street. He lived in a homeless shelter and sometimes slept under bridges. It was not the glamorous lifestyle of an artist that he was hoping for. Eventually, he started selling postcards he painted of the city to tourists and picked up a few jobs painting houses, but he still didn't make enough to afford an apartment. He would spend most of his money on basic necessities and art museums and opera show entrance fees. Then things changed slightly for Hitler. He met a man who was able to sell some of his artwork. The irony here is that this man was Jewish. Samuel Morgenstern was an Austrian businessman who dabbled in the art scene. For whatever reason, Morgenstern liked Hitler's paintings and managed to sell several of them. In fact, many of Hitler's early paintings were sold to Jewish buyers. At the time, it didn't seem that Hitler was racist enough to refuse the money from Jewish people for his art, but that would change by the time he rose to power as the head of the Nazi Party. Hitler was now making some money as a painter. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to get him off the streets and into a room in a hostel. During this time in Vienna, his art became more and more influenced by Austrian and German painters. Hitler even said Rudolf von Alt was his greatest teacher that he ever had. There are many similarities between von Alt's work and Hitler's, especially in their style of painting architecture and landscapes. However, von Alt had less of a problem drawing realistic people than Hitler did. Adolf Hitler later described his other influences as being from Greco-Roman Classicism, the Italian Renaissance, and Neoclassicism. The biggest influence on Hitler's life and what he would eventually turn into was the city of Vienna and the key players in it. In Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote, "For hours I could stand in front of the opera. For hours I could gaze at the parliament. The whole Ring Boulevard seemed to me like an enchantment out of the 1001 Nights." The beauty of the city enamored Hitler, but there was a darker side to things that would eventually lead him down a dark path. There were two main movements that influenced Hitler while he was struggling to be an artist in Vienna. Both had racist ideologies and blamed others for the problems of society. George von Schonerer was the leader of the Pan-Germanism movement in the city. This group of people believed that all German-speaking people should be unified under a single nation called the Greater Germanic Reich. You could probably tell which part of Hitler's ideology this influenced, as he would later do this very thing in World War II and call it the Third Reich. The second person who influenced Hitler in Vienna was the mayor of the city, Karl Lueger. It's Lueger who promoted the anti-Semitism principles that Adolf Hitler would adopt in life. Lueger explained how it was the Jewish business owners and Jewish people in general who were making life hard for the German middle and lower classes. When Hitler started his rise to power in the Nazi Party, he used the doctrines and tactics of both Schonerer and Lueger to rise to the top. The combination of both these men was just what Hitler needed to secure his position as the head of the party and spread his anti-Semitic belief system to the people of Germany. Basically, Hitler didn't do anything new to help him gain power. He just used what he had learned from the men he idolized in Vienna during his time as an artist there. For someone who ended up loving war so much, Hitler never registered for the military in Linz like all citizens were required to. In 1913, this decision caught up with him as the police started looking to arrest him. He needed to get out of the city, fast. Hitler had not given up on his artistic dream, but Vienna was getting too dangerous. He had some connections in Munich, so he packed what few personal possessions he had, and in May of 1913, got out of Vienna. Once in Munich, Hitler encountered slightly more success as an artist. He continued selling small watercolors and oil paintings of architectural features and landmarks in the city. A few wealthy patrons also commissioned Hitler to paint landscapes for them as well. Things were starting to look up for Adolf Hitler's art career. Then, suddenly it all came to a screeching halt. World War I had begun, and although this would give Hitler a new calling, his art would be put on hold for the time being. When World War I broke out, Hitler finally decided to fulfill his military duty. The embarrassing thing was that when he enlisted and took his fitness exam, he failed. He was deemed unsuitable for combat and support duty because he was too weak and incapable of firing weapons. Hitler didn't really mention this in his autobiography, probably because it would have been too embarrassing. But like with art school, he just didn't have the right stuff. In August 1914, the German army became desperate for infantrymen, and Hitler was able to finally enlist. While serving in World War I, he brought paper and canvas along with him to continue drawing and painting even as the war raged on around him. Even though Hitler volunteered to fight, he appeared to be more interested in continuing his art career than his actual duty. During this time, Adolf Hitler did his final paintings, which were made up of farmhouses, landscapes, and other images he saw during the war. After World War I ended, Hitler put down his brushes and replaced them with anti-Semitic rhetoric, fear-mongering, and his nationalistic agenda. Interestingly, once Adolf Hitler came to power as a leader of the Nazi Party and Führer of Germany, he did something unexpected with his painting career. For whatever reason, Hitler wanted to erase any trace of what he had done as a young artist from the face of the earth. He was so serious about locating and destroying all of his own paintings that he created a special task force and gave them whatever resources they needed to get the job done. A man named Schotte Strathaus was appointed by Hitler in 1936 to locate, buy, or steal any works of art created by him. Strathaus took his mission very seriously and located hundreds of works of art that Hitler had made. He destroyed them all. Strathaus spent years tracking down the paintings and only stopped when World War II broke out, and the Nazis needed every available soldier to fight in the war. This means that by the time World War II came to an end and Hitler shot himself in a Berlin bunker, only a handful of his pieces were still in existence. Much of his work was actually secured by the US Army, who collected them and hid them away in storage. There was never any intention of creating an exhibit out of them or letting the painting see the light of day ever again. However, the same can't be said about all the pieces of Adolf Hitler's artwork that found their way to private collectors. A group of 18 watercolor pieces was sold by Peter Jahn, a collector of Hitler's early work decades after the war, for around $50,000 apiece. More recently, a painting of Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria done by Hitler sold for approximately $113,000. In Germany, it is illegal to sell anything that has Nazi symbolism on it related to Hitler. However, if Adolf Hitler's signature is on an object and there are no Nazi symbols, then it's okay to sell and display. In 2015, 14 works of art created by Hitler were sold for $450,000 at a Nuremberg auction house. So, the question is, was Adolf Hitler a successful artist since his pieces are now selling for relatively large sums of money? The answer from many art historians and collectors is absolutely not. The reason these pieces are selling for so much money is because they were created by one of the most infamous and hated men who ever lived. If the paintings were created by anyone else, they would either be collecting dust somewhere or destroyed long ago. Most historians agree with the consensus of the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna that rejected Hitler twice. His early works show that he had some talent for painting architecture, but the pieces themselves don't show any emotion or take any risks. Heinz Joachim Maeder, who works as a spokesperson for the Kloss auction house in Berlin, said, "If you walk down Messina and see 100 artists, 80 will be better than Hitler." Maybe if Hitler had been allowed to study at the Academy of Fine Arts, he could have refined his skills and worked on painting humans in a way that evoked some kind of emotion. But he was never given the opportunity. It's crazy to think about how different the world could have turned out if Adolf Hitler was just a slightly better artist and had become successful. Perhaps the millions of lives lost during World War II could have all been saved. There's also another surprising aspect of Hitler's art that rarely gets talked about, something that foreshadowed the carnage that was to come. Although Hitler struggled to incorporate all of the elements needed to make his artwork stand out, he did employ some artistic techniques in his rise to power. By layering different colors in the form of anti-Semitism and national pride on the canvas that would become the Third Reich, Hitler was able to paint a picture in the minds of the German people. His experience in Vienna set the foundation for him to meet people with strong and terrible dogmas that he then incorporated into the Nazi movement. Even while in power, the rigid and emotionless techniques he used in his paintings became part of his main agenda. He would not let the human condition get in his way or veer from his path to creating a Nazi empire. Hitler even said that after he won the war, he would retire and spend the rest of his days painting. It seems he never gave up on his dream of becoming an artist, even as he destroyed the world around him. However, there is one art design that Hitler created that's probably more famous and recognizable than any painting in the world. Hitler describes his masterpiece in Mein Kampf when he says, "I myself, meanwhile, after innumerable attempts, had laid down a final form, a flag with a red background, a white disc, and a black swastika in the middle. After long trials, I also found a definite proportion between the size of the flag and the size of the white disc, as well as the shape and thickness of the swastika." That's right, Adolf Hitler was the artist who designed the Nazi flag. It's one of the most identifiable symbols in the world, and obviously not for good reasons. So if Hitler's goal was to make something that everyone would recognize and connect him with, he succeeded. The swastika that Hitler used in his design was a bastardization of a symbol from the ancient civilizations of the Near East and India. German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann found a similar symbol in the ruins of the ancient city of Troy and on old Germanic pottery. He assumed incorrectly that the two symbols meant Aryan people had an empire that spread across the world. This absolutely inaccurate conclusion led to many Aryan nationalist parties to adopt the symbol at the time, including Hitler's Nazi Party. Again, the symbol is not Aryan in nature and never was. It was just misappropriated from other cultures. Hitler used the colors black, white, and red in his design to represent the old flag of Imperial Germany. This symbolized a time when Germany was powerful and wealthy, which resonated with many people who were struggling to recover after the sanctions placed on the country after World War I. Looking back on Hitler's art career, we can safely say he was never going to be a great painter. His inability to express emotion through his artwork and the lack of innate talent made him a decent postcard maker and house painter, but only a mediocre artist. His most recognizable work of art is the Nazi flag, which is now only used by infinitesimally small numbers of people who, like Hitler, are monsters. Adolf Hitler failed at winning World War II, failed as a leader, and failed as an artist. Now watch why Hitler's nephew was his worst enemy, or check out last 24 hours of Hitler's life.